Section 1. The hidden architecture of a show everyone thinks they know. There is a very particular kind of comfort that comes from a show you have watched so many times that you know the outro music before it plays. You know the cadence of the theme song before the first note lands. You know the exact way the camera swings through that living room on 31 Spooner Street, the shuffle of feet on the stairs, the clatter of forks at the dinner table, the specific weight of the laugh track on certain jokes that you have heard enough times to anticipate by the setup alone. You have seen those faces, the round shape of Peter's head, the red hair and the patient eyes of Lois, the football shape of Stewie's skull, the gentle golden color of Brian in the corner of every scene so many times that they feel like neighbors rather than characters. Not people you invented a relationship with, but people whose presence in your peripheral life became part of the texture of the years you spent with them on in the background. That is what Family Guy became for an enormous number of people over the 25-plus years it has been on the air. Not just a show you watched, a show that was always on. A show that lived in the background of bedrooms and college apartments and late nights when nothing else was running and the alternative was quiet you were not ready for. A show that filled the space between other things with enough color and noise and recognizable rhythm that it functioned less like entertainment and more like a kind of ambient furniture, comfortable, present, not requiring your full attention to do its job of making the room feel occupied. But here's the thing about familiar shows. The familiarity becomes a kind of veil. You stop looking closely because you already think you know what is there. You watch the same characters walk through the same living room, and because you have done it 1,000 times, you stop noticing what is actually hanging on the wall behind them. You stop paying attention to what is being said in the background of scenes. You stop registering the expression on a character's face in the moment before they shift into the joke. You stop asking the questions that would make watching feel like excavating rather than relaxing. You become, in a very precise sense, a person who is present in front of the show without being present to it. And the show, which has been doing its work the entire time, keeps doing its work, and the deeper layers of it accumulate there in the dark while you half watch and half sleep and half exist in the comfortable space between attention and rest. Family Guy is one of the most thoroughly watched animated series in the history of American television. It premiered on the 31st of January 1999, airing immediately after Super Bowl 33 to an audience of approximately 22 million viewers, one of the largest first-episode audiences any animated show had ever pulled. The Super Bowl post-slot was, and remains, the most powerful launchpad in broadcast television. Anything that follows the game inherits a captive audience of tens of millions of people who have been sitting in front of their televisions for hours and have no particular reason to change the channel. Family Guy benefited from this enormously in a way that its initial cancellation somewhat obscured. The show was never given a fair test of its own audience before Fox began shuffling it across time slots with a randomness that made it impossible for viewers to follow consistently. It was canceled after its third season in 2002, not because the show was bad, the quality was demonstrably there, but because Fox had never given it a stable home. Then came The Resurrection, which is one of the stranger stories in television history. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air reruns on their Adult Swim block for almost nothing, because after its second cancellation, nobody thought the property was worth much. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim in April 2003, and almost overnight, Family Guy became the highest-rated program in that entire block. It drove viewership up by nearly 240%. The DVD sets for the first 2 seasons sold over 400,000 copies, which was an extraordinary number for a canceled cartoon. The combination of those numbers convinced Fox to order new episodes, and Family Guy returned for its 4th season in 2005 with a level of hype and expectation that most shows never experience even once. Hundreds of millions of people have seen episodes of this show since then. It has been discussed, analyzed, quoted, referenced, parodied, and picked apart in every corner of the internet for more than a quarter century. Most people who love it could describe the basic shape of it in their sleep. The family in the fictional Rhode Island city of Quahog. The father who is overweight and loud and operates largely on impulsive instinct rather than anything resembling planning. The mother holding the household together through a patience that repeatedly exceeds what any reasonable person should possess. The teenager daughter who exists at the intersection of everyone else's inattention and serves as both scapegoat and afterthought. The awkward son with the voice that has always sounded slightly wrong in ways that take a moment to place. The baby who is secretly something else entirely, operating on a wavelength that only his closest friend can receive. The dog who thinks of himself as a person and is correct about this in ways that the show made compelling for years, before gradually allowing to become something less interesting. And yet, underneath all that familiarity, there are layers to this show that the casual viewer never quite reaches. Mysteries that were opened and never resolved, sitting there across dozens of seasons, waiting for the viewer who would eventually pause and say, wait, what actually happened there? Dark corridors in the histories of the characters that the writers entered and then quietly walked away from, leaving the doors ajar behind them. Fan theories so internally consistent with the show's actual documented content that they have accumulated a kind of authority over the years, circulating across forums and social media and late-night conversations with the confidence of ideas that have been stress-tested and have held. Details buried in background frames, in throwaway dialogue, in the specific way characters react to each other in moments. The comedy is not foregrounding details that suggest the people who made this show, at least in certain periods and at their best, were doing something considerably more deliberate and considerably stranger than the surface presentation suggested. The show that you have watched for years while falling asleep, while eating dinner, while filling the silence of a room at 11 o'clock on a night with nothing else to do, is not quite the show it appears to be. There is a version of Family Guy that becomes deeply unsettling when you start looking at it from the right angle. There is a version of every major character in this show that is considerably darker than what you absorbed across the years of comfortable background watching. There are real stories from the real-world stories involving the man who created this show, involving the specific morning when his life came closer to ending than most people will ever come, that cast a shadow over everything else the show contains, a shadow that most viewers do not carry with them when they sit down to watch. This is not an attempt to ruin something you love. Quite the opposite, because understanding the depth of something does not make it less comforting. Knowing that a forest is ancient and full of history does not make it less peaceful to walk through at dusk. The depth makes the comfort richer. The familiarity becomes layered in a way that ordinary familiarity cannot be once you know what is underneath it. You settle in not just to something you recognize, but to something that keeps quietly revealing itself. Every episode you have already seen contains things you have not seen yet. The show you thought you knew completely contains rooms you have never been in. So let us settle in. Let us move slowly through the hidden architecture of a show that most people think they already know everything about. Let us look at the details the animators buried in background frames, the character histories that were only half told in scattered references across hundreds of episodes, the theories that emerged from years of careful and obsessive watching, and the real events that happened in the actual world to the actual person who built all of this, that gave the whole thing a gravity it was never supposed to carry, but carries anyway. The world where the Griffin family lives follows rules that are recognizably close to but not quite identical to the rules of the real world. The streets look right, the houses look right, the social dynamics feel like something you could locate in the America of the show's creation, late 90s suburban Rhode Island, with the specific texture of that time and place rendered in the bright colors and confident outlines of Fox animation. But the governing physics of this world are different from our own in ways that become significant the more you pay attention. People survive things here. Not just survive in the cartoon sense of bouncing back from slapstick injury without lasting damage. They survive things that should change them permanently and then find themselves unchanged at the start of the following episode. Relationships are destroyed and then not destroyed. Catastrophic events leave no trace. Deaths occur and are then undone. The world of the show repairs itself constantly, with a thoroughness and efficiency that would be remarkable even if you accepted it as a genre convention, and even more remarkable once you start asking why. The mechanism is called the reset, and Family Guy applied it more aggressively than almost any other show in its cultural moment. Each episode was designed to begin from approximately the same starting position regardless of where the previous episode had ended. Not because this was careless storytelling, the show's best writers were not careless, but because the reset was a structural choice that served the comedy. Consequence is the enemy of certain kinds of humor. If things that happen in one episode carry forward to the next, the range of things that can happen shrinks. If Peter can be permanently ruined by a bad decision, you have to be careful about what bad decisions you let him make. The reset removed that caution. It gave the writers freedom to go anywhere, because anywhere was recoverable. But the reset also did something else. It made the show's world a place where everything is survivable, where nothing is permanent, where the worst night always ends in a morning that looks like the morning before. This is, on its surface, a comfortable proposition. The world of Family Guy resets. No matter how bad it gets, it resets. Until you start asking, resets to what? And the answer is, to the family. The people reset. The damage resets. The circumstances reset. But the family does not reset away. The family persists through everything. They are always there, in the same house, at the same address, when the next episode begins. Through all the catastrophes and the reversals and the amnesia about what happened last week, the one continuous thread is the presence of these specific people in this specific place. That is not a comfortable observation once you look at it directly. Because the family, examined without the comedic framing around them, is not doing well. They are doing things to each other that families in the real world would be evaluated for. The relationship patterns they exhibit would, if the comedy were stripped away, describe something that the people inside it could not easily leave and could not easily stay in. They are not exactly trapped, and they are not exactly choosing. They are in the condition that most families are actually in, which is somewhere between those two states, sustained by the inertia of shared history and the particular difficulty of imagining a world in which you are not the person you have been to each other. The horror of the show, if horror is the right word, lives here. Not in the violence or the explicit darkness of any particular episode. The discomfort lives in the thing the show was always saying about family while packaging it as comedy. That a family can be doing tremendous sustained harm to the people inside it and still be a family. That the presence of people who love you imperfectly can look, from the inside, almost identical to the presence of people who are hurting you in ongoing ways. That the specific experience of being in a family that you cannot fully leave and cannot fully enter is one of the most common human experiences there is, and also one of the least discussed because the families we are in tend to lack the perspective to name what they are doing to each other. The show knows this. There are moments, scattered across its run, where it drops the comedy framing entirely and just says the thing it has been circling around. A character turns and delivers something so bluntly honest about their situation that the laugh track sounds wrong behind it. Those moments are where the real show lives. Everything else is the vehicle that gets you there. We are going to go through all of it, every major character, the specific darkness of what the show actually documented about each of them, separate from the comedy framing that usually surrounds it, the buried details and the background secrets, the fan theories that emerge from close attention to what the show chose to show and what it chose to leave unresolved. And the real-world stories, the ones that happen to the actual human beings who made this, that sit underneath the fictional world like the foundation of a house, invisible from above but essential to everything standing on top of it. This is going to take a while. That is right. Settle in. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I am genuinely curious how many different corners of the world this reaches at any given moment. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. It is free, it takes 1 second, and it means you will be there for everything that comes after this one. Family Guy is one of the most thoroughly watched animated series in the history of television. It premiered in January of 1999, came back from cancellation twice, and has been running continuously in some form for over 2 decades. Hundreds of millions of people have seen episodes of this show. It has been discussed, analyzed, quoted, and picked apart in every corner of the internet. Most people who love it could describe the basic shape of it in their sleep. And yet, underneath all that familiarity, there are layers to this show that the casual viewer never quite reaches. Mysteries that were never explained. Dark corridors in the histories of characters that the writers opened and then quietly walked away from. Fan theories so deeply constructed and so eerily consistent with the actual content of the show that they have taken on a life of their own. Details hidden in backgrounds, in dialogue, in the way characters move and react, that suggest the people who made this show were doing something far more deliberate and far stranger than the surface suggests. The show that you have watched for years while falling asleep, while eating dinner, while filling the silence in a room, is not quite the show it appears to be. There is a version of Family Guy that is deeply unsettling when you start looking at it the right way. There is a version of every major character on this show that is considerably darker than what you absorbed the first 100 times you watched. And there are real stories from the real-world stories involving the man who created the show that cast a shadow over the whole thing that most viewers do not carry with them when they sit down to watch. This is not an attempt to ruin a show you love, quite the opposite. Because understanding the depth of something does not make it less comforting. Knowing that a forest is ancient and full of history does not make it less peaceful to walk through at dusk. If anything, the depth makes the comfort richer. The familiarity becomes layered in a way that ordinary familiarity never can be. You settle in not just to something you know, but to something that keeps quietly revealing itself. So, let us settle in. Let us move slowly through the hidden rooms of a show that most people think they already know everything about. Let us look at the details the animators buried in corners, the character histories that were only half told, the theories that emerged from years of careful watching, and the real events that gave the whole thing a kind of gravity it was never supposed to have. There is something distinctly strange about the world of Family Guy that does not announce itself. It does not wave a flag or put up a sign. It just sits there, waiting for you to notice. The town where the Griffin family lives is called Quahog, Rhode Island. It is a fictional small city that follows the rules of its own particular reality, a reality where a talking dog is completely unremarkable, where a baby can build a time machine in his bedroom without anyone calling a developmental specialist, where the same man has been in spectacular brawls with a giant chicken across multiple decades without either of them dying or addressing why the conflict started. These are the accepted premises of the world. They were not invented to be examined. They were invented to be funny. But somewhere along the line, something happened. Fans started watching closely. Fans started pausing. Fans started writing long posts in the middle of the night about what certain details and background frames actually meant, about what the show's own continuity inadvertently revealed about its characters, about what the patterns of behavior across hundreds of episodes added up to, if you looked at them not as disconnected jokes, but as a coherent body of evidence. And what they found was not always comfortable. The family at the center of the show, Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian, is not a family that makes sense if you look at it long enough. The relationships are wrong in ways that go beyond dysfunction. The power dynamics are wrong in ways that go beyond comedy. The histories of these characters, when you piece them together from dozens of throwaway references across hundreds of episodes, suggest backstories so grim that they could belong to a different genre entirely. Each character in this show carries something dark inside them. Not the cartoon dark of exaggerated stupidity or silly violence, but something closer to actual psychological horror. Something that suggests the people who wrote this show, at least in its best and most intentional periods, were interested in something more than punchlines. They were interested in what it actually looks like when a family falls apart from the inside, and what it takes for people to keep pretending that everything is fine when the evidence that it is not fine is overwhelming. The show knows this about itself, by the way. There are moments scattered across its run where it does not bother with the comedy veneer at all, where it just says the quiet part out loud, where a character turns and delivers something so bluntly honest about the situation they are in that the laugh track feels inappropriate. Those moments are the real show. Everything else is the delivery mechanism that gets you to them. We are going to go through all of it. Every major character, every significant theory, every buried secret and hidden detail and real-world story that bleeds through the screen. It is going to take a while. And that is exactly right. Because this show, the real version of it underneath the familiar version, deserves more than a quick summary. It deserves to be walked through slowly, in a quiet voice, with all the lights turned low. So before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is. I am genuinely curious how many different corners of the world this reaches. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment. It is free, it only takes a second, and it means you will be there for everything that comes after this. Section 2, the real story of Stewie Griffin, the evil genius, and what he actually wanted. To understand what is genuinely unsettling about Stewie Griffin, you have to go back to who he was supposed to be, not who he became. Not the softer, more emotionally accessible version of the character that the show gradually moved toward over the course of its later seasons. The original version, the Season 1 version. The version that Seth MacFarlane described in interviews as an evil Rex Harrison, a reference to the British actor best known for playing a highly intellectual, deeply imperious figure who considered himself above the ordinary concerns of lesser human beings. Stewie Griffin was created, according to MacFarlane himself, with a specific concept in mind. The comedy was supposed to come entirely from contrast. You had this tiny, round-headed baby in a yellow shirt and a diaper, sitting in a high chair, eating his strained peas. And out of that baby's mouth came language so sophisticated and violent and strategically detailed that it belonged to a Bond villain in a mountain fortress, not a creature still learning to walk. The contrast between the vessel and the content was the entire joke. The joke never needed a setup because the setup was built into every frame. The visual absurdity of an infant plotting the systematic domination of all human civilization. But what made early Stewie more than just a funny premise was the specificity of his plans. He was not vaguely evil in the way that cartoon villains often are. He had operational goals. He built working weapons, a ray gun, a mind control helmet, a shrink ray, a weather-altering machine in a laboratory hidden within his bedroom at 31 Spooner Street, accessed through what appeared to be an ordinary closet. The fact that this laboratory existed, fully stocked and functional, in the bedroom of a 1-year-old living in a Rhode Island suburb is one of those details that sounds absurd when you say it quickly, but becomes genuinely peculiar when you sit with it for a moment. Someone built those machines. Someone sourced the components. Stewie, whatever his intellect, cannot drive to a hardware store. The supply chain for Stewie's arsenal is a mystery that the show never once addressed. The target of his most constant attention in those early seasons was his mother, Lois. Not just the world in general. Specifically, repeatedly, and with genuine mechanical ingenuity, he was trying to kill his mother. Every episode had at least one moment given to this. Sometimes it was a line, a casual offhand comment about her impending death delivered while she spooned him his breakfast. Sometimes it was an elaborate scheme involving multiple stages and contingency plans that would have impressed a military strategist. The obsession was real and consistent, and the show never played it for shock. It played it for the dissonance between how it sounded and how Stewie delivered it, which was always with the calm, measured certainty of a person who had thought this through and considered it inevitable. The reason Stewie gave for wanting to kill Lois, when he articulated it directly, was that she had imprisoned him in what he called his 9-month stay in her ovarian Bastille. That phrase, ovarian Bastille, is worth pausing on. The Bastille was a fortress used as a state prison in France, a symbol of oppressive confinement, and the storming of it in 1789 is still one of the defining moments of revolution against tyranny. Stewie applied that metaphor to his time in the womb. He experienced gestation as political imprisonment. His arrival into the world was not a birth, it was an escape from captivity. And Lois, who had involuntarily housed him for those 9 months, was the captor he had never forgiven. The episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang, from the show's first season, revealed something extraordinary. When Stewie was born, the doctor delivering him found, tucked inside Lois, a map of Europe with the capital cities circled and annotated with bombing plans. A 1-year-old baby had, in the womb, already developed a detailed strategy for military strikes against major European population centers. This detail was played as a joke, just another absurd thing about the Griffin family, but it implies something genuinely strange about the nature of Stewie's consciousness. His plans predate his birth. His malevolence is not something he developed. He arrived with it already formed. There was also an early episode, Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, that gave audiences a glimpse of Stewie's future self. The older Stewie, essentially what Stewie would become if allowed to grow and fulfill his potential, was presented not as a reformed person who had found happiness, but as a version of himself who had achieved the kind of power and control he had always sought. The future Stewie was harder, colder, and entirely uninterested in the emotional bonds that would come to define the character in later seasons. He was the logical endpoint of the original concept. A genius baby grown into a genius adult who had built a world around his own exceptional mind and had very little use for the ordinary warmth of human connection. The show made the deliberate choice not to let Stewie reach that future. The writers, including MacFarlane, decided in the mid-seasons that the evil genius character had run its course and began steering him towards something gentler, something more emotionally open, something that traded the sharpness of his original concept for a new kind of relatability. Whether that was the right creative decision is something reasonable people can disagree about, but it is worth understanding what was lost when it happened. What was lost was a character built around a philosophical position that the show was never quite brave enough to articulate directly. Early Stewie was, at his core, a study in what it might look like if a consciousness arrived into the world fully formed and looked at the entire apparatus of family and society and domestic life and found it absurd and confining and beneath him. He was not born wanting love from Lois. He was born wanting freedom from her. He was not yearning for the warmth of family connection. He found that warmth to be a kind of trap, a comfortable prison more insidious than the physical one he had escaped. This is an unusual and genuinely interesting idea for a comedy show to be built around. The family sitcom as a genre depends on an implicit agreement that family is valuable and that the domestic sphere is where meaning lives. Stewie's original characterization was a direct challenge to that premise. He was the creature in the family who could not be absorbed by the warmth of it, who refused to find comfort in the rituals of it, and who was building, quietly and relentlessly, toward an exit from the whole arrangement. The version of Stewie that most casual viewers remember from later seasons, the one who cries over his feelings, who treasures his friendship with Brian, who goes to concerts and develops crushes and expresses vulnerability in ways that feel almost therapeutic, is a fundamentally different character wearing the same small body. He is warmer and perhaps more palatable, and certainly easier to write for over many seasons. But he is also much less frightening in the specific way that early Stewie was frightening, because early Stewie was frightening not because he had weapons, but because he had a point. There is another layer to Stewie's mystery that the show touched on once, and then retreated from. In an episode aired during a later season, Stewie is sent to speak with a school counselor. The counselor, like most characters in the show, is not supposed to be able to understand him, but in this particular session, something slips through. Stewie begins talking, and at some point the conversation reaches a genuine moment of confession. He reveals something he claims he has never told anyone. And what he reveals is not that he is evil. What he reveals is that his accent, the precise, aristocratic, mid-Atlantic British accent that he speaks in every episode, is not his real voice. He demonstrates his real voice. It sounds startlingly like Peter, rough and provincial and ordinary and utterly at odds with the persona he projects. The implication of this is considerable. Stewie's entire identity, the one he performs every single day inside that house, is a performance. The accent is not natural. The vocabulary is chosen. The posture and the diction and the careful removal of any warmth from his tone are all elements of a character he is playing. For reasons that the show never fully explored, Stewie Griffin built a persona from the very beginning of his conscious life, and the persona he built was as far from his actual voice as a person can get. He became, voluntarily and deliberately, the most dramatically different version of himself that he could imagine. Which raises a question the show never asked. What was he running from? What was it about his real self, the one that sounds like Peter, the one that is rough and ordinary and suburban, that required such a radical reimagining? Section 3, Who Can Actually Hear Stewie, the mystery that was never fully solved? One of the quietest and most genuinely unresolved questions in the entire run of this show is deceptively simple. Can they hear him? It sounds like a technical question about the rules of the show's reality. But the more you think about it, the stranger and more unsettling it becomes. Because the answer the show gave was not consistent, was not stable, and changed depending on what the writers needed for a particular scene. And that inconsistency, which might seem like sloppy storytelling, actually opens up a space for something much stranger than a simple yes or no would. Here is what we know from the show itself. Brian Griffin, the family dog, can hear Stewie. He can understand every word. They have full, ongoing conversations. They have debates. They have arguments. They have moments of profound emotional honesty with each other. The quality of their conversation implies that Brian does not just receive Stewie's words, he receives the full weight of what those words mean, the intelligence behind them, the emotional register they are delivered in. Brian and Stewie communicate completely. Whatever Stewie says, Brian gets. The other characters are not so clear. Seth MacFarlane, when asked about this directly over the years, gave an answer that was at once honest and deliberately evasive. He said that the adults in the show essentially understand Stewie but tend to dismiss what he says because he is a baby. They process his words as something cute and not worthy of serious attention. They hear him, but they do not listen, which is a distinction that sounds reasonable but raises its own complications. If Peter and Lois can understand Stewie, then every moment in the early seasons where Stewie announced his plans to kill Lois in her presence calmly, specifically, with operational detail, was a moment where Lois heard what he said and chose not to respond. Not because she thought it was baby babble, but because she heard the word murder coming out of her infant son's mouth and decided that the correct response was to continue making dinner. The horror here is not that a baby wants to kill his mother. The horror is the mother's indifference to it. There is a reading of Lois Griffin's character that this implication opens up, a reading that the show never fully explored but which the evidence consistently supports. Lois is not oblivious. She is detached. There is a difference. Obliviousness is a kind of innocence. Detachment is a choice. If Lois hears Stewie describe specific plans to end her life, and her reaction is to ask if anyone wants more pot roast, she has decided that the information is not relevant to her. She has processed it and filed it under "not my problem." The warmth she projects as a mother is real in some ways, and completely hollow in others. And the Stewie situation is where the hollowness shows most clearly. The season 19 episode, titled Stewie's First Word, gave the show's most direct engagement with this mystery. In it, Stewie yells a profanity loudly enough that everyone in the vicinity hears it and understands it. He is surprised by this. Brian is surprised by this. And Stewie theorizes that the reason it happened is that he was feeling such an intense emotion in that moment that his words broke through whatever barrier normally prevents people from fully registering them. His theory is that he can only be understood by the general public when he is in the grip of extreme feeling. This is an interesting answer, but it is also deeply troubling if you follow it to its logical end. Because what it suggests is that the rest of the time, the hundreds of hours across hundreds of episodes where Stewie speaks with complete clarity and is seemingly ignored, he is not quite landing. His ordinary voice, delivered at his ordinary emotional register, does not register for the people around him. They are getting noise where he is delivering language. Only Brian, for reasons that were never adequately explained, hears him clearly all the time regardless of emotional state. Why Brian? Why would a dog be the only member of the household with the consistent ability to hear a baby clearly while two adult human beings filter him out? McFarlane's explanation, that the adults hear but dismiss, does not fully account for why Brian never dismisses. Brian is not more intelligent than Lois in any measurable way. He is more perceptive, perhaps. More emotionally attuned, in the early seasons at least. But the consistency of his reception suggests something more than just attentiveness. It suggests that Brian and Stewie occupy a similar frequency that whatever makes Stewie comprehensible is something Brian naturally shares or accesses in a way that the humans around them do not. There is a fan theory that ties into this, one we will get to in fuller detail later, that proposes Brian's intelligence is not naturally his own, that he was, at some point, given a human brain or some equivalent enhancement that explains why he walks on two legs, drinks martinis, drives a car, writes novels, and has romantic and philosophical aspirations far beyond any ordinary dog. If that theory holds, then the connection between Brian and Stewie makes more sense. They are both creatures existing outside the ordinary boundaries of their species. Both of them are in bodies that do not quite contain them. Both of them are translating something interior and extreme through an exterior that the people around them find unthreatening. Stewie's baby body makes his words easy to dismiss. Brian's dog body makes his intelligence easy to accept without fully reckoning with what it means. The two of them found each other because they were the only two beings in that house who were truly, consistently, operating at their actual level of consciousness. The family around them was not quite present enough to notice. And so they built their friendship inside a kind of mutual recognition. You can see me, I can see you. And nobody else around us has the faintest idea what is actually going on. This is a lonelier picture of that friendship than the show usually draws. The warmth between Stewie and Brian was real, and some of their episodes together were genuinely moving. But underneath the warmth was a foundation of profound isolation. They were close because they were both invisible to the people who were supposed to love them. And both of them, in their different ways, had built their entire personalities around that invisibility. Stewie became grandiose and theatrical because if nobody was going to hear him anyway, he might as well perform for himself. Brian became cerebral and aspirational because if the people around him were not going to engage with his actual interior life, he might as well continue developing it in private. There is also a detail from the early seasons that received very little attention but deserves more. In the episode Running Mates, from the second season, Brian briefly appeared to hear Stewie's thoughts rather than just his spoken words. For a moment, the two of them were connected not just through speech but through something more interior. The show did not pursue this. It was used for a joke and then dropped. But the implication that Brian and Stewie's connection might have a dimension that goes beyond ordinary hearing, that Brian might be receiving from Stewie at a level that even Stewie is not always consciously projecting, is one of those loose threads that makes the whole relationship feel more mysterious than the comedic scenes on top of it. Suggest? The question of who hears Stewie matters for a specific reason. It determines how guilty everyone else in the family is. If Peter and Lois genuinely do not understand a word Stewie says, then all those years of Stewie plotting and announcing his plans in front of them are essentially harmless, the failed communication of a very unusual baby. But if they understand him and choose to respond to him the way they do with inattention, with dismissal, with the kind of passive non-engagement that treats his actual words as less important than whatever is currently on television, then the picture changes considerably. Then the family is not just oblivious. They are, in a very quiet and ongoing way, refusing to see the person standing right in front of them. And refusing to see the person standing in front of you is one of the most common and least discussed forms of harm. Section 4. Brian Griffin, the darkest character on the show that nobody talks about. The strangest thing about Brian Griffin is not that he is a dog. The strangest thing is how little anyone in the show finds it strange that he is a dog. Peter accepts it completely. Lois accepts it. The neighbors accept it. The town accepts it. Brian walks into bars, drives cars, holds intelligent conversations with adults about literature and politics and personal philosophy, gets drunk with a level of dedication that suggests a chronic relationship with alcohol, and writes what he considers serious fiction. And nobody finds this unusual. In a show full of absurd premises, a baby with a time machine, a talking chicken who has a recurring feud that spans decades, a mayor who may or may not be genuinely delusional, Brian's existence should stand out as the most inexplicable. But it does not. And the reason it does not may be because the show on some level wants you to accept Brian as a person so completely that his species stops registering as a detail. It almost works. For most of the show's run, Brian feels more like a person than Peter does. More thoughtful, more self-aware, more capable of articulating what he wants and why he wants it. The show built him as the character through whom the audience was supposed to make contact with the rest of the Griffin family. He was the grounded one, the sensible one, the one whose perspective most closely approximated how a reasonable adult human would react to the madness happening around him. But if you look at the actual history of what Brian does across the show's run, the grounded perspective starts to look like a performance. A very convincing one, but a performance nonetheless. Because underneath the carefully maintained image of the intellectual, emotionally advanced, cosmopolitan dog, Brian Griffin has a list of actions that would be genuinely shocking in a non-comedic context. There is the most famous piece of analysis in the show's fan community, the speech delivered by Quagmire in the episode Jerome is the New Black. Quagmire, who had always had a simmering dislike for Brian that the show treated as an unexplained character quirk, finally laid out his reasons in full. He called Brian a phony. He pointed out that Brian claimed to be a great writer but had produced no serious work. He pointed out that Brian claimed to care about Peter's feelings while consistently pursuing Lois in front of him. He called out Brian's political lectures as performances rather than genuine beliefs, the kind of positions that someone adopts to seem interesting rather than because they have actually wrestled with the material. And he ended by saying that he could forgive Brian for all of this if he were not such a bore. The Quagmire speech became iconic partly because it was clearly intended by the writers as a valve, a way of acknowledging that Brian had become grating to a significant portion of the audience, and a way of expressing that acknowledgement from within the show itself. But it was also a genuinely accurate accounting. Every single thing Quagmire said was supported by evidence from the show. The claims were not exaggerations, they were observations. Brian did hit on Lois in front of Peter, repeatedly and without apparent guilt. Brian did claim literary ambitions he never fulfilled. Brian did use political and intellectual posturing as a substitute for genuine engagement with the ideas he claimed to care about. And the self-help book he eventually published titled Wish It, Want It, Do It was, by the show's own reckoning, vapid and commercially motivated in a way that made his years of claiming to be a serious writer seem even more hollow. The episode in which that book was published is worth spending a moment with, because it reveals something about Brian's character that the show usually keeps more carefully hidden. When the book became a bestseller, Brian did not respond with relief, or with a kind of bittersweet recognition that success had arrived through the wrong door. He responded with arrogance. He became contemptuous of Stewie, who had encouraged him to write the book in the first place. He became dismissive of everyone around him. The success activated something in Brian that had been latent beneath the self-deprecating exterior, a genuine belief in his own superiority that had always been there but had been masked by years of unfulfilled ambition keeping him humble. When Brian failed, he was often likable. The failures kept him close to the ground. They gave him the quality of the talented underachiever who has not yet been ruined by success. But the moment success arrived, even the kind of commercial success he claimed to disdain, the mask slipped. The Brian underneath was considerably less warm than the Brian on top. Then there is the fan theory about Brian's origins, and it is one of the more quietly persuasive ones in the entire Family Guy canon. The premise is that Brian Griffin is not an ordinary dog who happened to develop human intelligence naturally. The premise is that Brian is a genetic experiment, possibly the product of a CIA program, since the Family Guy universe contains plenty of evidence of highly experimental government science happening quietly in the background. The theory draws on the fact that other animals in the Family Guy universe who achieve human-level behavior are often the result of deliberate intervention. Klaus, the talking fish in American Dad, is explicitly a human brain in a fish body, the result of CIA experimentation. American Dad and Family Guy exist in the same universe, which the show has confirmed in various crossover moments. If Brian is an experimental subject rather than a natural phenomenon, then everything about his life reads differently. His placement with the Griffin family was not accidental, it was arranged. His capabilities were engineered. His consciousness was not evolved, it was installed. And that would make his loyalty to the Griffin family not the instinctive bond between a dog and his adopted home, but a more complex relationship between a created thing and the people. It was placed with a relationship that might include affection, but that also carries a kind of existential uncertainty that ordinary pets never have to face. This theory also explains something the show never addressed directly. Why does Brian age so slowly? Dogs typically have a lifespan of 10 to 15 years. The Griffin family has had Brian for the entirety of the show's run, without any meaningful aging on his part. Even accounting for the cartoon reality where most characters do not age, Brian's stasis is notable. If he were a genetic construct rather than an ordinary dog, a longer lifespan would be a built-in feature rather than an anomaly. Brian's death in the Season 12 episode, Life of Brian, is worth examining in this context as well. He was hit by a neighbor's car, on the street outside the house he had lived in for years. It was abrupt and completely without narrative setup. One moment he was alive and in the middle of a conversation. The next he was mortally injured in the street with the family gathered around him. The show treated the death seriously, giving it real emotional weight, and the immediate aftermath, the family adjusting to life without Brian, Stewie's grief, the arrival of the replacement dog Vinny, was handled with a sincerity that felt unusual for the show. And then, 2 episodes later, it was entirely undone. Stewie acquired a time travel device and went back to save Brian before the car could hit him. Brian returned. The grief, the adjustment, the new dog, the entire period of mourning, all of it was retroactively made to have not happened. The show presented this as a happy ending. Stewie saved his friend. But something strange happened in the immediate aftermath of that reversal that the show barely acknowledged. Brian came back changed. Not visibly, not in any way the other characters could point to or name. But the Brian who returned from his temporary death was, if anything, more extreme in the negative character directions the show had been moving him. The arrogance increased, the selfishness increased, The hypocrisy increased, as though the brush with non-existence had not softened him but had instead burned away whatever was left of the impulse to pretend otherwise. Section 5, Quagmire's True Nature. What the show actually tells you if you're paying attention. Glenn Quagmire is the character that Family Guy uses to do the things it does not want to attribute to the characters it needs you to like. He is the valve through which the show releases pressures that would be too destabilizing if directed elsewhere. Peter cannot carry the full weight of the show's most nihilistic sexual humor because Peter is the main character and the audience needs to maintain a functioning relationship with him. Brian cannot carry it because Brian is positioned as the intelligent one, the moral one, the one whose perspective the show endorses. Quagmire carries it because Quagmire is disposable enough, in the show's emotional architecture, to absorb things that would damage the other characters. But this makes Quagmire, when you look at him clearly, one of the most genuinely disturbing portraits the show produced. Because unlike Peter's violence or Stewie's evil genius, which are framed within theatrical unreality, Quagmire's behavior is grounded in something recognizable. His predatory nature is not cartoon exaggeration. It is depicted with enough specificity that it lands differently than the show's other dark content. Glenn Quagmire was born Glenn Quagelchek, a detail the show revealed and then mostly forgot. He was a former Navy ensign who became an airline pilot. He lives at 29 Spooner Street, next door to the Griffins. According to his driver's license, as shown in the episode Foxy Lady, he is 61 years old, though he consumes so many carrots, by his own explanation, that he appears to look significantly younger. This detail, a man who is 61 years old but presents as considerably younger through some dietary intervention, is so strange and specific that it almost feels like a clue rather than a joke. Quagmire's relationship with Lois Griffin is the longest-running unrequited obsession in the show. He has wanted Lois since before Peter and Lois were married. The episode Meet the Quagmires, which involved time travel back to a point when Lois and Peter had not yet formalized their relationship, established that Quagmire knew both of them before the marriage and had been carrying his feelings for Lois through the entire span of their friendship with Peter. Every barbecue, every dinner, every night at the Drunken Clam, he has been sitting with those feelings. He never acted on them in any serious way, at least not with Lois's knowledge, but the consistency of the feeling across decades of implied continuity makes it something more than a running gag. His relationship with women in general is where the show went further and darker than it usually acknowledged directly. The show made Quagmire's predatory behavior into a comedic feature for many seasons. His famous catchphrase, the way he oriented every conversation toward the same destination, the sheer relentlessness of his pursuit, these were played as harmless exaggerations of a certain kind of male social type. The show enjoyed having this character in the group. He made certain kinds of humor possible that could not otherwise happen. But the details the show revealed about his actual history, when you accumulate them across episodes, describe something significantly beyond a character who just really likes women. The show acknowledged, through its own narrative, that Quagmire had committed crimes. That his behavior extended well past aggressive flirtation into territory that the law names specifically. These were not always shown on screen. The show kept the worst implications just off to the side, visible in the implication, but not in the execution. But the implication was consistent and specific enough that a viewer who was paying attention over many seasons could not miss it. What makes this interesting rather than just disturbing is the contrast with how the show treated Quagmire in the episodes that focused on his personal life rather than his predatory behavior. The episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, aired in Season 10 and presented Quagmire with something the show rarely gave him: genuine moral heroism. His sister Brenda was in an abusive relationship with a man named Jeff. Quagmire's love for his sister was depicted as sincere and deep. His horror at what she was enduring was real. And the resolution of that episode placed Quagmire in a position of protective violence that the show endorsed rather than condemned. He was protecting someone he loved. He was willing to face serious consequences to stop something genuinely wrong from continuing. This Quagmire, the brother, the protector, the person who could see abuse clearly because he had spent enough time adjacent to the worst impulses in himself, was a different character than the one the show usually presented. The two versions of Quagmire are not contradictory in any simple way. They are, unfortunately, entirely consistent with how human beings actually work. The capacity for harm and the capacity for care are not opposites that cancel each other out. They coexist. They always have. Quagmire also had a father who the show used as an explanation, though not quite a justification for some of what he was. Ida Davis, who had been Quagmire's father Dan Davis before a gender transition in the episode Transfat, was a character who helped fill in the outlines of where Quagmire came from. The relationship between Quagmire and his parent was complicated in the way that Family Guy sometimes allowed relationships to be complicated when it was paying close attention. There was love there. There was also a great deal of difficulty, and Quagmire's response to that difficulty was, characteristically, to not talk about it in any direct way. There is a version of Quagmire's character that the show teased but never fully developed a version that explored what it might mean to be a person who genuinely does not know how to connect with other people, except through the mechanisms of pursuit. The friendships with Peter, Joe, and Cleveland were real friendships, and the show depicted them with warmth. But Quagmire's emotional life as it related to women was, from everything the show showed us, stunted in a way that he never examined and the show never quite asked him to examine. He pursued, and the pursuit was the entire shape of his emotional engagement. What came after the pursuit was never shown with any depth. What that suggests, in the quieter reading, is a man who is terrified of what exists after the chase. The chase is something he understands. It has a structure and a goal and an endpoint. What follows the endpoint, the ordinary sustained intimacy of actually knowing someone, of being known by them in return, was the territory Quagmire consistently fled from. His infatuation with Lois makes more sense through this lens. Lois was unavailable. She was always going to be unavailable. The pursuit could be sustained indefinitely because it could never arrive anywhere, and that made her safe in the specific way that actually achievable relationships were not. Section 6. The Pewterschmidt Darkness. Lois and the Secrets Behind the Wealthy Family. Lois Griffin was born Lois Patrice Pewterschmidt into one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, was the owner of a major industrial conglomerate called Pewterschmidt Industries. The Pewterschmidt name carried weight, money, and the particular social architecture that extreme wealth builds around itself, a wall of comfort and respectability that, in the Family Guy universe, turned out to be thinner than it appeared. The Pewterschmidt family had secrets, not the small domestic secrets that most families carry. Genuine, significant, life-altering secrets that were concealed for decades and had ongoing consequences for people who had no knowledge of what was being hidden from them. The most dramatic of these was Patrick. Lois had an older brother who she did not know existed for the first 30 years of her adult life. Patrick Pewterschmidt had been institutionalized as a child, locked away in Brookfield Insane Asylum, and Carter Pewterschmidt had simply never mentioned him to his daughter. The reason Patrick ended up in an institution was, by the show's own account, that he walked in on his mother performing a sexual act with celebrity Jackie Gleason, and the experience triggered a psychological break that his parents chose to manage through permanent institutional confinement rather than through treatment. There are several things worth lingering on here. The first is the specific nature of the break itself. What Patrick saw was not, by itself, something that should necessarily produce a 30-year stay in a psychiatric facility. Traumatic discoveries about parental behavior are something that human beings regularly encounter and process without being permanently institutionalized. What Patrick's case suggests is that his psychological state was perhaps already precarious enough that the discovery was a final destabilizing event rather than the cause in itself, or, alternatively, that his parents' decision to lock him away was not primarily about his mental state, but about their desire to manage a situation that could have produced public embarrassment for the family. Carter Pewterschmidt in this reading did not commit his son because his son was genuinely too dangerous to live in the world. He committed his son because his son was inconvenient. And he kept the existence of that son hidden from his daughter for 30 years because knowledge of Patrick would raise questions about the family that Carter did not want asked. When Lois did eventually discover Patrick and made the decision to release him from the institution, the consequences were immediate and severe. Patrick, who had been confined and medicated and socially isolated for decades, had developed during that time into something the institution had failed to treat or address. He had constructed an elaborate logic of blame that centered on fat people, specifically on the idea that Jackie Gleason, who was overweight, was the source of his destruction, and that fat men in general represented the threat that had ruined his life. He began killing fat men in the town of Quahog. He became a serial killer. The Fat Guy Strangler, as the news media called him, was Lois Griffin's long-hidden older brother, and the direct result of decades of institutional confinement ordered by her father to protect the family name. Carter Pewterschmidt, as the show depicted him over many seasons, was a man whose wealth had given him the practical ability to be as monstrous as he chose to be without facing consequences. He treated Lois with a particular cold condescension that the show often played for comedy. His contempt for Peter, his dismissal of the Griffin children, his consistent message to his daughter that she had chosen poorly, and that choosing poorly had consequences. But the Patrick situation revealed that Carter's own choices, made from a position of enormous power, had produced harm that radiated outward through decades. There is also the matter of the cure for cancer. In at least one episode, Carter Pewterschmidt was revealed to be actively suppressing a cure for cancer, not keeping it secret out of ignorance, but deliberately preventing it from reaching the public because the continued existence of cancer was more financially beneficial to his medical industry holdings than a cure would be. This was played as a dark joke, the kind of extreme villainy that the show could attribute to a side character without needing to fully reckon with what it said. But it is worth noting that this detail was not walked back. It was not presented as a misunderstanding or a false accusation. Carter was, according to the show's own canon, a man who knew a cure for cancer existed and chose to keep it from people because of what it would cost him financially. Lois grew up in this family. She absorbed its values and its way of relating to the world before she had the perspective to evaluate them. The warmth she eventually developed, the effort she made to be a genuine mother, a genuine partner, a genuine member of a community that had very little in common with the one she came from was, in some sense, an act of active reconstruction. She was trying to build something different from what she had been given. But the early seasons of the show, and occasional later episodes, suggested that the Pewterschmidt inheritance was not something Lois had entirely escaped. There were moments where a different Lois surfaced, briefly colder, more calculating, more capable of a kind of ruthless practicality that the warm suburban mother persona concealed. The episode "And I'm Joyce Kinney" from Season 9 revealed that Lois had starred in a pornographic film during her college years, a secret that was used against her publicly. The show treated this as an embarrassing revelation. But what it actually demonstrated was that Lois, in her youth, was not the person she had constructed herself to become. She had a wilder, more experimental, less carefully managed past that her current persona was built partly to cover. There is a line Lois delivers in a later episode, in a tone that was clearly intended to be jarring, that captures something real about her character. She describes herself as a secret little psycho with very little to lose. It is presented as a joke. But a joke about what a person actually is when no one is watching is not purely a joke. It is also information. Lois's mother, Barbara Pewterschmidt, was not given much depth by the show, but what depth she was given complicated the family picture further. The affair with Jackie Gleason, the one that Patrick witnessed and that cost him 30 years of freedom, was Babs's act, not Carter's. The family dynamic was not simply Carter's corruption seeping downward. There was mutual damage at every level. What the Pewterschmidt house contained, under the beautiful furnishings and the prestigious name and the accumulated influence of old money, was the same thing that money always struggles to contain. People who had never been required to be honest with each other. People who had never been required to be honest with themselves. And the consequences of that dishonesty, generation after generation, distributed themselves through children and grandchildren who had not chosen it and could not fully escape it. Section 7. The Peter is dead theory. The fan theory that changes everything. Somewhere in the early 2010s, a post appeared on a Reddit thread devoted to fan theories that proposed something extraordinary. The post was not long. It was not elaborately argued, but it described a reading of Family Guy that was so internally consistent with the actual content of the show, and so genuinely dark that it went viral in cycles for years afterward and eventually became one of the most discussed fan theories in animation history. The theory was this: the world of Family Guy, all of it, every episode, every character, every impossible coincidence and absurd adventure does not exist. It is a fantasy, a sustained, highly detailed hallucination produced by a man sitting in a room in a psychiatric institution, unable to face the reality of what has happened to his family. That man is Peter Griffin. The theory begins with the character of Meg. In the fantasy version of the show, Meg is physically unattractive, socially humiliated, universally dismissed, and treated with cruelty by her own family. There is no apparent reason within the show's logic for why this particular characterization was chosen for her. She is not especially unusual. She is not especially cruel. The abuse she receives is not the result of any particular provocation. It simply exists, and it is directed at her with a consistency that goes beyond ordinary comedic targeting. The theory proposes that in the real world, outside the fantasy, Meg Griffin was a beautiful and popular teenager. She was the child Peter was most proud of. She was the one the family was most excited about. And then, one night, Meg made a choice that destroyed the family permanently. She got behind the wheel of a car while drunk and drove her younger brother Chris somewhere. The accident killed them both. Chris, who in the fantasy is depicted as awkward, clueless, and not particularly intellectually capable, was, in reality, according to the theory, a child who had an intellectual disability caused by oxygen deprivation at birth. He was a vulnerable person who depended entirely on the family around him for his care. Meg, in her recklessness, took him out and got him killed. Lois, who was pregnant at the time with the baby who would become Stewie, did not survive the grief. She took her own life. She never gave birth to the son she was carrying. Peter was left alone, his 3 children, 2 of them dead, 1 of them never born, his wife gone. Everything he had built across the years of their marriage ended in a single night because of a car accident and the choices that led to it. He could not process this. He was not built for it. The grief was not something any ordinary human architecture could hold, and Peter's was weaker than most. He broke under it completely. He ended up in an institution. In the institution, Peter began constructing the fantasy we watch. He took the memory of his family and rebuilt it according to the specific emotional logic of his guilt and grief. Meg became ugly and unpopular in the fantasy because Peter on some level blamed her for everything. She caused the deaths, she was responsible. And so, in the world he built inside his head, she is punished constantly. The family despises her. The world dismisses her. Every episode featuring her humiliation is a small repetition of the punishment Peter could not actually deliver in the real world. Stewie the baby who was never born became in the fantasy a genius of extraordinary potential. Because the only thing worse than losing a child is losing one before they have had any chance to become anything. Peter did not know who Stewie would have been. And so, in the fantasy, Stewie becomes everything. He is brilliant, inventive, capable of anything, building impossible machines and plotting the future of civilization from inside a diaper. He is the child Peter never got to have, imagined into the most spectacular version of what a child could be. Stewie wants to kill Lois. This detail, which seems like pure absurdity in a comedy context, resolves entirely in the theory's framework. Peter blamed Lois for something, perhaps for Meg's behavior, perhaps for her own death, perhaps for a failure he perceived in the life they had built together. The anger that could not be directed at the dead was redirected into the fantasy and assigned to the imaginary baby who embodied both what Peter had lost and what he was most angry about. Brian is Peter's intelligence. In the fantasy, Peter is an idiot, reckless, impulsive, operating on instinct rather than reason. But Peter in the real world was not a stupid man. He was a man who failed, whose family came apart under circumstances that included real failures of his own. The intelligence he could not allow himself to own, because owning his intelligence would require owning the ways in which he had used it poorly or not used it at all, was externalized. Given fur and a martini and a half-finished novel, made into a companion who was smart in all the ways Peter could not be in the version of himself he could face. Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe. The friends who visit Peter at the bar in the fantasy are his real friends visiting him at the institution. They come to check on him. They sit with him. In the fantasy, their visits become the afternoons at the Drunken Clam, because that is how Peter's mind translates caring presence. The bar is the institution's recreation room. The beer is something else. The conversations are distorted versions of the actual conversations they have with him through the glass of his deteriorating mental state. This theory became as widely circulated as it did because it is not easily dismissed. Almost every element of it has a corresponding piece of evidence in the show. The random resets, the way catastrophic events leave no trace by the following episode, the way death itself is reversible, the way characters can forget things that should define their entire relationship with another character. All of these look like flaws in a lazy television show, until you hold them against this theory. Then they look like symptoms. The logic of trauma-induced fantasy does not hold continuity the way ordinary life does. It resets, it repairs, it refuses to remember the damage. The one part of the show that the theory makes most uncomfortable is the part about Meg. Because if the theory is right, then every episode where the Griffin family treats Meg with contempt is an episode where a grieving man, sitting in an institution, is replaying his anger at the daughter who took his family away from him. The comedy of Meg's humiliation, which the show maintained for a decade, and which a significant portion of the audience found genuinely funny, is in this reading a portrait of something that has no comedy in it at all. It is a man failing to forgive. It is a man who cannot stop punishing someone because the punishment is all he has left. Meg never gets better in the show's long central period because Peter never gets better. The institution is still where he lives. The fantasy keeps going because reality is still too much to return to. The family he imagines spending his days with is the family he lost, rebuilt in a shape that his guilt requires, one where the person responsible for the loss is present enough to be punished, but distorted enough that it cannot quite be her, the real her, the one he loved before everything went wrong. Section 8: Background Secrets and Easter Eggs. What the animators hid in plain sight. Every animated show has its background details. The jokes that play out behind the main action for the benefit of the fraction of the audience that will pause their DVD at the right moment, or catch a reflection in a shop window, or notice what a newspaper headline says when the camera swings past it. Family Guy has more of these than almost any other animated show in history, and some of them are considerably stranger than the quick visual puns they appear to be at first glance. The most famous category of these is the newspaper headline gag. There is a running pattern in the show where newspapers and other printed media carry headlines that are not related to whatever the characters are doing, but are commenting on the show itself, or on the viewing experience, or on something about the nature of the world the show is set in. One such headline, glimpsed briefly during the episode Model Misbehavior, reads DVDs paused for headline, Joke Millions Disappointed. This one was widely noticed and celebrated precisely because it anticipated the behavior of the audience so exactly. Of course, the people watching would pause at the newspaper. Of course, they would be looking for exactly this. And the show's acknowledgement that it knew they were looking while simultaneously making the joke entirely self-defeating by revealing that nothing was there is the kind of layered absurdity that characterized the show at its best. There is also a recurring blink and you miss it presence of what fans have called Holden Caulfield, an unnamed recurring background character who appears in various episodes at key moments, usually doing something that positions him as a skeptical or cynical observer of whatever is happening around him. The character has no official name and is never acknowledged by any of the main cast. He exists only in the margins of scenes, watching. The name Holden Caulfield, after the protagonist of The Catcher in the Rye, was given to him by fans and some crew members because his consistent posture, that of a person who is deeply unimpressed by the performance of the people around him and considers them phonies, matched the character Salinger, created. The upside-down message is another example worth noting. In one episode, as a character takes off from a particular location, the wall behind them contains writing that is displayed upside down. If you are watching on a standard television, you would not see it. If you happen to pause at the exact right moment and rotate your screen, it reads, "If you can read this, your TV is upside down." The show hid a message that could only be seen if someone was doing something impractical, and the reward for doing that impractical thing was a joke about how impractical the effort was. The references to show staff and to other productions in the Mutant Shared Universe are woven through the background of many scenes. Because the shows exist in the same universe, something that has been confirmed in multiple crossover moments, background details from one show sometimes appear in the other. In the episode Stewie Kills Lois and its sequel, when what appears to be government agents come through a door, those agents are Stan Smith and Deputy Bullock from American Dad, rendered in that show's visual style and dropped casually into the Family Guy frame without comment. The only audience members who would recognize them are viewers who watch both shows attentively enough to know the secondary characters on site. The show was rewarding that specific subset of its audience with a detail that anyone else would simply see as two men in suits. Seth Green, who voiced Chris Griffin, is also the co-creator of Robot Chicken, an adult animated show that Family Guy regularly lampooned and references critically. The joke the show could make, but never quite made directly, was that every time a character in Family Guy made fun of Robot Chicken, the voice of Chris Griffin was coming out of the creator of Robot Chicken's mouth. The joke existed in the casting rather than in the dialogue. It was a meta layer that could only be appreciated by viewers who knew about the real-world relationship between the two shows and between Green and the rest of the Family Guy team. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, is also associated with the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Mila Kunis, who voices Meg, has had a prominent film career, including the film Bad Moms. The show periodically acknowledges these real-world associations in background details and offhand references the joke always being that the voice actor exists in the real world in a way that the character does not, and that this creates a kind of double exposure where you can see both the character and the person through the same frame if you are looking at the right angle. The Wilhelm scream, a sound effect originally recorded in 1951 for the film Distant Drums, and since used in hundreds of films and television shows as a recurring inside joke among audio professionals, appears multiple times throughout Family Guy's run. It is the kind of detail that audio engineers place in productions for each other, a professional handshake passed down through decades of filmmaking. Most audiences have no idea it is there because they have no frame of reference for what they are hearing. But for people who know the sound, and there are communities of people who track its appearances across cinema and television with considerable enthusiasm, it shows up in Family Guy with enough frequency to suggest that someone in the sound department was a dedicated practitioner of the tradition. There is also a recurring visual detail related to The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film. The carpet pattern from the Overlook Hotel, one of the most recognizable visual elements in horror cinema, a complex geometric design that Kubrick used with specific intentionality throughout the film, appears in Family Guy in various background settings. It shows up in hallways, in carpeted rooms, in locations where a viewer would not necessarily be looking at the floor. It is not highlighted. It is not explained. It just exists for the viewer who notices it as a quiet gesture towards something much colder than the comedy happening in the foreground. Another background detail that received attention from careful viewers was the recurring presence of a specific piece of graffiti in certain outdoor locations within the show's version of the town. The graffiti reads "Redrum," the word murder spelled backward, from The Shining, where it was used as the first sign of Danny Torrance's psychic perception of the violence coming for his family. In a show full of darkness that is performed openly and loudly for comedic effect, Redrum in the background of an otherwise normal street scene is darkness of a different kind. It is not asking to be laughed at. It is just sitting there, on the wall, waiting to be read by someone who knows how to read it. The giant chicken fights, the recurring spectacular brawls between Peter and an anthropomorphic chicken named Ernie deserve their own category of hidden detail. Each fight is longer and more elaborate than the last. Each one destroys property on a scale that would, in a realistic setting, result in criminal charges for both parties. Each one ends without resolution. The cause of the conflict, the original grievance between Peter and Ernie that started everything, was never clearly explained. It involved a coupon, something to do with an expired coupon that Ernie gave Peter, and Peter's response to this minor social infraction was so extreme that it set off a cycle of violence between them that spanned years and possibly decades. But the hidden detail in the chicken fights is not about the fights themselves. It is about what happens between them. In the episodes where Ernie appears, if you look at his scenes outside the fight sequences, you can see a character who has a life. He has a wife. He has social engagements. He exists within the world of the show in ways that extend beyond his role as Peter's adversary. He is not a villain in any meaningful sense. He is a person or a person-shaped entity who got into a conflict with a neighbor and has not been able to escape it. The fights are not just physical comedy. They are the portrait of something more depressing, Two people locked in a cycle that neither of them chose, and neither of them knows how to end, destroying things around them that are not connected to whatever started it. The show confirmed in a later season that Ernie the Giant Chicken has finally died, ending the long-running feud. His death was treated as a joke in the tradition of the whole arc. But there was something in it, in the finality of it, in the acknowledgement that the thing that had been running in the background for all those years was over, that landed differently than expected. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane's real life and how it bled into the show. There is a story about Seth MacFarlane and the 11th of September 2001 that most people who know anything about Family Guy have heard at least once. But hearing it summarized in a sentence does not capture what it actually means to sit with the full shape of it. So let us take it slowly. On the morning of the 10th of September 2001, Seth MacFarlane was in Providence, Rhode Island. He had been at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, giving a lecture to students. After the lecture, as people who have given talks at their old schools tend to do, he went out with some faculty members for drinks. It was a late night. It turned into the kind of late night that does not fully resolve until early the next morning. He was scheduled to fly back to Los Angeles on American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport on the morning of September 11th. The flight was a 7:45 departure. His travel agent had listed the departure on his itinerary as 8:15. The combination of this error and the lingering effects of the previous night meant that MacFarlane arrived at the airport approximately 10 minutes after the gate had closed. He went to the desk. The agent told him he was too late. He accepted this, found a seat in the airport lounge, and fell asleep. He woke up 45 minutes later to the sounds of people reacting to something happening on a television. American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked and had crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Everyone on board was killed. MacFarlane turned to the person next to him and said that he had been booked on that flight, that he had missed it by minutes, that he had just woken up to find out he was alive. This is the story as MacFarlane has told it in various interviews over the years, and it is consistent across every telling. The details, the lecture, the drinks, the wrong time on the itinerary, the 10 minutes, the lounge, the 45 minutes of sleep have not changed. The documentation supports it. He was booked on that flight. Now consider what this means in the context of Family Guy. At the time of the 11th of September 2001, Family Guy had already been canceled once by Fox. It had survived its first cancellation and produced 2 seasons before being taken off the air. It was in the process of fighting to survive, generating the Adult Swim audience and the DVD sales that would eventually convince Fox to bring it back. The show existed, in a very real sense, because of Seth MacFarlane, because of his specific vision and his specific voice and his specific understanding of what the show should be. If MacFarlane had been on time to the gate that morning, the show as it existed and as it would come to exist would have been over. Not just changed or diminished, completely ended. The revival would never have happened. American Dad would never have been made. The Orville would never have been made. Ted would never have been made. The entire extended creative universe that MacFarlane built over the 2 decades following that morning would not exist. There is something uncanny about the specific mechanics of the near miss. The wrong time on the itinerary, not by an hour, not by 30 minutes. 15 minutes. A 15-minute error in a written document was the thing standing between MacFarlane's presence on that flight and his absence from it. 15 minutes and a hangover that made it difficult to compensate for the error by arriving unusually early. The margin was so thin that it is uncomfortable to dwell on. MacFarlane himself has spoken about how he processed the experience. He described it not as a source of survivor's guilt, which is the more expected emotional response, but as something that simply happened and that he had tried to learn whatever could be learned from it. He acknowledged that the experience was strange and that there was something disorienting about walking through the world afterward with the knowledge of how close the line had been. The show that returned in 2005, 4 years after that morning, was different from the show that had existed before. Different in the ways that the transcript laid out different animation, different writing staff, different tonal center of gravity. But it was also different in a way that is harder to name. There was something in the post-revival Family Guy that was slightly more willing to go dark than the original run had been, slightly more willing to dwell in uncomfortable places, slightly less interested in resolving every episode in a way that sent everyone home feeling okay. Whether this was causally connected to what happened on that morning is something that nobody can say with any certainty. MacFarlane has not drawn that connection publicly in any explicit way. But the show he made after September 2001 was made by a man who had sat in an airport lounge and woken up to find out what had almost happened to him. And that kind of knowledge, the specific knowledge of how close the edge actually is, tends to leave its mark. There are elements of the show that read differently with this knowledge. The recurring theme of characters who survive things they should not survive. The constant resets that restore the world to its pre-disaster state. The ease with which the show undoes deaths and catastrophes that would be permanent in any realistic context. You can read these as lazy storytelling. You can also read them as a specific kind of wish fulfillment, the fantasy of a world where the edge is always closer than you realize, but nobody ever actually goes over it. Where the worst things that almost happen do not quite happen. Where you always wake up in the lounge with 45 minutes to spare, and outside is just the regular morning. MacFarlane's creative output after 2001 was also marked by a strain of sentimentality that sat oddly alongside the show's reputation for nihilistic comedy. The moments in Family Guy where genuine emotion broke through, where a character said something true and painful, and the joke did not follow, were more frequent than the show's reputation suggested. And the best of them had a quality of earned feeling that went beyond craft. They felt like something real had been brought into contact with the work. The episode Brian and Stewie, where the two characters are locked in a vault together and Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has thought about using it on himself, has that quality. It is not funny. It was never trying to be funny. It was trying to say something about the specific loneliness of being a person who is invisible to the people who are supposed to see you, and about how far that loneliness can go if no one interrupts it. That episode aired in 2010. Seth MacFarlane wrote it. It remains, for many people who have watched the show extensively, the one episode they point to when asked if Family Guy was ever more than a comedy. Section 10, The Giant Chicken, the unsolved mystery at the heart of every fight. Every long-running show eventually creates something it cannot fully explain. Something that began as a joke and gradually accumulated weight through sheer repetition until the question of what it meant became more interesting than the joke itself ever was. For Family Guy, that thing is the giant chicken. The chicken's name is Ernie. He is the size of a person. He walks upright, wears clothes, holds a job, and has a wife named Nicole. He is, by every functional measure, a member of the community, a fully integrated social being who participates in the ordinary life of the town around him. Nobody in the show finds his existence particularly unusual. He is just a giant chicken who lives in the area and occasionally, unpredictably, becomes involved in prolonged and catastrophic violence with Peter Griffin. The fights between Peter and Ernie are among the most technically elaborate pieces of animation in the show's entire run. Each one is longer than the last. Each one escalates beyond the physical parameters of what two bodies should be capable of sustaining. Buildings are destroyed, trains are derailed. Explosions occur in sequences that would read as action movie set pieces if the combatants were human beings, rather than a man and a bird. The fights play out with a kind of desperate gravity that makes them feel like something serious is at stake, even though neither character can articulate what that serious thing is. The origin story, when it was eventually provided in flashback, is so anticlimactic as to constitute its own kind of joke. Ernie gave Peter a coupon. The coupon was expired. Peter's reaction to this minor social transgression, which is, in the real world, a mild inconvenience of the kind that most people experience, process, and forget about within a few hours, was to become furious. And then to act on that fury with a physicality and a persistence that continued through the following episodes and then the episodes after that, across what the show implied were many years of accumulated conflict. The question the show never asked about this, the question that hangs over every fight sequence and gives it an undercurrent of something more disturbing than comedy, is why. Not why the first fight happened. The first fight happened because Peter overreacted. That is comprehensible, if extreme. The question is why the pattern continued. Why, after the first fight, did neither of them let it go? Why did Ernie not move away? Or get a restraining order? Or simply never speak to Peter again? Why did Peter not apologize? Or try to resolve the situation? Or simply avoid the person he had gotten into a catastrophic brawl with? The answer the show's structure implies, though it never states it, is that the conflict had become its own reason for continuing. It had achieved a kind of self-sustaining momentum. The fights were no longer about the coupon. Maybe they had never been about the coupon. The coupon was the surface event that activated something pre-existing in both of them, some capacity for this specific kind of conflict that had been waiting for a trigger. And once the capacity had been activated, the trigger was no longer necessary. The fighting continued because fighting was what they did now. Because the other person was the context in which a specific version of themselves existed, and without that specific conflict, that version would have nowhere to be. There is a phrase for this in psychology. It is called a relational role. A part of yourself that only exists in relation to a specific other person, the version of you that emerges in the presence of your most difficult sibling, or the version of you that exists only in the context of your oldest grudge. Peter and Ernie had created a relational role for each other through the coupon incident, and everything after that was the two of them living inside it. What makes the chicken fight more interesting than a simple recurring gag is what it reveals about Peter Griffin's inner life. Peter is, on the surface, a character defined by impulsivity. He reacts before he thinks. He acts without foresight. The comedy of his character is supposed to come from the gap between his confidence and his competence, between what he thinks he can handle and what he actually can. But the chicken fights show a different Peter. They show a Peter who can sustain focus and commitment over years, who can match a technically skilled opponent at a physical level that requires coordination and endurance far beyond what his ordinary life requires of him, who shows up every single time with everything he has. This Peter, the one who fights the chicken, is competent. He is capable. He is not winning every round, but he is more than holding his own. And the question of why this version of Peter only surfaces in this specific context and nowhere else in his life is one the show never addressed, but that hangs over the whole thing if you let it. There is a theory among close watchers that the chicken fights represent the version of Peter's life where the stakes feel real, that everything else, the family, the job, the friends, the community has been so thoroughly stripped of genuine consequence by the show's reset culture that nothing in those arenas actually registers as serious. But the fights with Ernie have always ended with uncertain outcomes. There is always the possibility that this one is the last one, that this time the thing ends definitively. That possibility gives the fights a weight that Peter's ordinary life does not have. In the fights, things matter. Everything is at stake. And so Peter fights with a quality of full presence that he cannot access in any other context. The confirmation in a recent season that Ernie the Giant Chicken has died, that the long-running feud has ended not through resolution, but through one combatant's natural end, is the kind of conclusion that sounds like comedy but arrives with something heavier than laughter. The fight is over. Peter did not end it. Ernie simply stopped being there. And what that leaves for Peter is not triumph. It is the particular emptiness that comes when the thing you have been struggling against for years is simply gone, and there is nothing to mark the end except the absence where the struggle used to be. Section 11, Meg Griffin and the truth the show was always telling. The Meg situation is the aspect of Family Guy that most careful viewers eventually reach a point with. Not a point of comedy fatigue exactly, but something more like a reckoning. A moment where you stop laughing and start asking what it actually is that you have been watching. Meg Griffin, as a character, entered the show as a specific and coherent person. She was a teenager in a household that had more than its share of intensity, trying to find her place in a social world that was not naturally hospitable to her. She was not glamorous. She was not especially talented in the ways that the entertainment culture around her said talent was supposed to look. She was ordinary in the specific way that teenagers can feel most ordinary, which is surrounded by people who are, by various measures, exceptional. In the early seasons, Meg's ordinariness was the joke, but it was a gentle joke with warmth in it. The humor came from the contrast here was this completely normal teenage girl, and around her was a baby plotting world domination, and a talking dog writing a novel, and a father who could not be trusted near anything that moved. Her normalcy was played as a kind of anchor. She was the one the audience could most easily recognize as coming from their own experience of ordinary life. The show's shift from using Meg's ordinariness as the source of comedy to using her suffering as the source of comedy happened so gradually that it is difficult to identify the exact moment when it crossed. There was no single episode that constituted the turn. It was a slow accumulation, one episode where the joke about her was a little crueler than before, another where the physical comedy at her expense was a little more graphic, another where a family member's contempt for her was presented with a little more relish, until the accumulation had crossed a line that individual steps had not. By the middle seasons of the show's run, Meg's role in the family was genuinely disturbing if you stripped away the comedic framing and looked at the relationships plainly. Peter did not just make fun of his daughter. He actively expressed a wish that she did not exist. He made her the target of physical humor that, in a non-animated context, would be described as abuse. He forgot her during crises in ways that suggested not absent-mindedness but genuine indifference to her well-being. He had apparently, in a flashback scene presented as comedy, tried to abandon her at a fire station when she was an infant. The show's most honest moment about all of this came in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party. Trapped in the house during a storm, Meg finally deployed all of it. She turned to her family and said what had been true for years. She described Peter with specific accuracy, his selfishness, his recklessness, his failure as a father, his pattern of treating her as beneath his notice except when she was available as a target. She described Lois's passivity in the face of it, her failure to intervene, her participation in the dynamic through her own coldness. She said things that were documented by the show's own history. She was not exaggerating. She was citing. The family fell apart. Without Meg as the common target, without the shared dynamic that had organized their interaction for years, they turned on each other. What had appeared to be a family with one scapegoated member turned out to be, under examination, a family held together entirely by scapegoating. Remove the target, and the structure collapses. The warmth that appeared to exist between the other members, the apparent love between Peter and Lois, the apparent affection between the siblings, all of it was revealed to be dependent on the shared project of directing damage toward Meg. And then the episode ended with Meg apologizing, walking it back, agreeing to return to the role, telling Brian that she had decided it was necessary for the family's cohesion that she continue to absorb what they directed at her. The show presented this as Meg being selfless, as Meg making a choice to protect her family. But the logic of what she was describing, that her suffering was a structural requirement for everyone else's functioning, is the exact logic used in real situations of abuse to keep people trapped in them. You are necessary because you are the target. Your role is to receive this so that others do not have to. Removing yourself from this role would hurt everyone. Therefore you stay. Meg stayed. The show continued. The abuse continued. It was not until the addition of more women to the writing staff, which happened in later seasons, that the treatment of Meg began to shift. The episodes became more careful. The cruelty was dialed down. Meg began to be written as someone with competence and resilience, someone who fought back rather than absorbing, someone whose identity extended beyond the role she had been assigned. In the crossover episode with The Simpsons, Lisa Simpson told Meg that she mattered and helped her discover a genuine musical talent. The show, when it tried, knew exactly how to write Meg as a real person. What makes this arc complete, in a strange and uncomfortable way, is that Meg's situation mirrors something the show was always telling about itself. The show that was called a comedy, that was packaged as a comedy, that was sold as a comedy, contained within its central family a dynamic that was not funny in any honest sense. And for many seasons, the audience laughed at it because the frame around it said to laugh. The frame said this was comedy. The frame said the correct response was amusement. The frame, as it turned out, was the show's deepest trick. Section 12. What the show was always really about. When you have spent enough time with all of this, with Stewie's real voice hidden under the accent, with Quagmire's genuine emotional stunting, with Brian's performance of intelligence over its reality, with the Pewter-Schmidt family's beautiful and terrible architecture, with the theory of Peter sitting in an institution trying to rebuild what he lost, with Meg's decade of unprotected suffering, you start to see a different shape underneath the familiar one. The show that you thought you knew was about a dysfunctional family in a funny town, doing ridiculous things and recovering fully by the next episode. That description is accurate in the way that any summary is accurate. It covers the surface. But the show that exists underneath that description is about something considerably more searching. It is about the impossibility of being known. Every major character in Family Guy is operating with a version of themselves that they present to the people around them and a version of themselves that they actually are. Stewie has the British accent over the Rhode Island voice. Brian has the intellectual persona over the fraud. Peter has the lovable idiot over whatever the original, smarter, more responsible person he might have been was. Lois has the warm mother over the cold, practical intelligence she inherited from her father. Quagmire has the social charm over the vast, isolating loneliness of a person who cannot function past the pursuit. Meg has the role of the family's scapegoat over the actual person who wants to be seen and loved like everyone else. None of these gaps ever fully closed in the show's run. The characters occasionally bumped up against their own hidden truths, had scenes where something came through that was not part of the performance, and then the reset arrived and the performance resumed. This happened so consistently that it stopped feeling like sloppy writing and started feeling like a statement. This is what family life is. Not the exceptional moments where people break through to each other. The relentless, exhausting performance of the versions of themselves that everyone has agreed to accept, because the alternative, the actual encounter with who everyone really is, would require more honesty than anyone in that house had the equipment for. The show knew this about itself. Not always, and not consistently, but in its best moments it did. The episode where Brian told Stewie about the gun in the vault is a show that knows. The episode where Meg told her family the truth is a show that knows. The episode where Stewie sat in a counselor's office and let his real voice through for just long enough to hear what it sounded like is a show that knows. These moments did not change anything in the diegetic world of the show. Everyone reset. Everyone went back to their performance. But the moments happened. They were witnessed. The show held them up for long enough that the audience could feel them, and then it moved on, because the show was also afraid of what would happen if it stayed there. There is something in that specific rhythm, the glimpse of truth, followed immediately by the return to performance that is genuinely uncomfortable, in a way that goes beyond what any specific episode intends to produce. Because we know that rhythm. Most people know that rhythm from their own experience of family life. The moment where something real breaks through, and then the collective agreement to proceed as if it did not, because the alternative is a conversation that the structure of the relationship cannot hold. Family Guy was, for years, one of the most watched shows in America. Millions of people put it on in the background, or fell asleep to it, or watched it in the particular kind of social watching that does not require full attention. And what they were falling asleep to, what they were watching with half a mind while doing something else, was this. A family that could not see each other clearly. A world that kept resetting to protect everyone from the consequences of what had been established. A set of characters who had built performances so complete that even they had trouble locating the persons underneath. That is not a sad story, exactly. Or, not only a sad story, there is comfort in it too, the same comfort that drew so many people to the show in the first place. Because if the family on screen cannot quite see each other, and if they keep resetting and performing and getting through the week without ever having the conversation that would change everything, they are also still there, still at the dinner table, still arguing about nothing, still in that house on Spooner Street, imperfect and limited and failing each other in slow, ongoing ways and still, for whatever it is worth, present. The reset is not just erasure, it is also continuity. Every episode begins again in the same house with the same faces and the same voices. Whatever was destroyed last week is rebuilt. Whatever was revealed last episode is quietly buried. The family persists. And for a viewer who understands, on some level, what it costs a family to persist, what you have to not look at, what you have to not say, what you have to keep performing when you are tired, that persistence is not nothing. It is, in fact, kind of everything. Stewie Griffin will always be in that high chair at breakfast with his plans already formed. Brian will always be at the table with his martini and his unfinished novel and his carefully maintained performance. Peter will always be doing something reckless with the complete conviction that it will work out. Lois will always be standing at the counter trying to hold it together because someone has to. Meg will always be hoping that today is different. Chris will always be somewhere in the background, doing something that nobody fully registers. And the house will always be there, and the week will always reset. And whatever happened before does not quite apply to what happens next, because the show has always understood that the most persistent thing about a family is not the damage they do to each other, though that persists too. The most persistent thing is the house, the shared walls, the fact that they come home to the same address. That is the hidden architecture. That is the thing underneath the cutaways and the chicken fights and the baby with the time machine and the talking dog who wants to be taken seriously. It was always a story about a family that could not find each other, told by a show that kept resetting so it could start looking again. And there is something in that, if you let yourself sit with it quietly enough, that does not feel like horror at all. It feels, despite everything, a little bit like home. If you are still here, thank you, genuinely. Something like this takes time to get through, and you stayed with it, and that means more than I can easily say. Drop a comment with where you watched from and what time it was when you finished. I love knowing where in the world these reach. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit the button, it takes 1 second, and it means you will be there for the next one. Whatever you are doing when you finish the sleeping, working, just sitting in a quiet room, I hope it is restful. I hope the house you are in feels a little warmer than it did before. See you next time. Extended Exploration. The deepest lore of every character. This section goes deeper into each character's story, the things the show revealed slowly across seasons, and the details that only make sense when you accumulate them across the whole run. Peter Griffin. The man before the myth. The thing about Peter Griffin that gets lost in the later seasons, when his stupidity had been amplified to the point of parody, is that the early Peter was a genuinely recognizable human being. He was working class. He drank beer with his friends at a bar in his neighborhood. He had a job at a toy factory and then a brewery, and he was not particularly distinguished at either of them. He watched television in the evenings. He made decisions based on immediate impulse and immediate appetite, rather than on any considered long-term planning. He loved his wife in the way that ordinary men love their wives, imperfectly and inconsistently, and with the kind of taken-for-granted sureness that sometimes functions as love and sometimes functions as its absence. The Flanderization that transformed Peter into a cruel and dangerous figure over the course of the later seasons did not happen all at once. It happened the way that most character decay happens, which is incrementally and through small individual decisions that each seem manageable in isolation and then accumulate into something that has moved far from its origin. In the first 3 seasons, Peter made bad decisions because he did not think things through, not because he was incapable of basic reasoning. There is a specific and important difference between a person who does stupid things and a person who is stupid. The early Peter was the first. He was capable of understanding consequences when they arrived. He felt bad when he hurt people. He apologized. He tried to repair things. The character that the show gradually produced, the Peter of season 10 onward, had lost most of those qualities. His capacity for genuine feeling about other people had narrowed to something that could not reliably produce warmth or guilt or the ordinary motivation to make amends. He became a character who could push his wife underwater to protect himself from what he thought was a shark without pausing to feel conflicted about this. He became a character who could steal candy from his own baby without experiencing any of the small internal friction that the action should have produced. He became, in the specific way that the show was not quite willing to name directly, a person whose empathy had atrophied from disuse until it was present only in vestigial form. What makes this strange, rather than just sad, is that the show occasionally and briefly accessed the original Peter even in the later seasons. There were episodes where something genuine broke through, where the character behaved in a way that was recognizably the season 1 version of himself making a mistake, feeling the wrongness of it, being moved to try to address it. These moments were not isolated to any particular period in the show's run. They showed up across many seasons, scattered irregularly through episodes that were otherwise committed to the Flanderized version, which means the original was always available. The writers who produced those moments knew how to write that Peter. They chose, in most episodes, not to. The relationship between Peter and his father Francis Griffin carries a significant amount of the show's underlying explanation for who Peter became. Francis, played by the late Charles Napier, was a strict, religiously conservative, emotionally withholding man who made his disapproval of Peter's choices clear without ever quite telling Peter what he should have done differently. The relationship was the template from which Peter's own fatherhood was partly built, not because he replicated Francis directly, but because a person who was never told clearly that they were enough tends to produce a specific kind of parental uncertainty. You give the children either too much of what you needed and did not receive, or too little, and you frequently cannot tell which you are doing. because you do not have the reference point of having received the right amount yourself. Peter's treatment of Meg, the sustained contempt that became one of the show's most discussed and most criticized features, was eventually, in a late-season episode, given a specific origin. He had been bullied and abused by his own older sister when they were growing up. The abuse was physical and emotional. It was serious enough to have shaped the way he engaged with the people in his immediate proximity for the rest of his life. And when the show revealed this and allowed Peter and Meg to have a genuine moment of recognition and reconciliation over it, the moment was real. It was moving. The show knew exactly what it was doing. And then the next episode, everything was back to the baseline. The knowledge that had passed between them in that conversation was simply not carried forward. The reset that the show applied to everything applied to this too, which means the episode was not a change. It was an acknowledgement. The show acknowledged the origin of the harm, allowed the two characters to recognize each other through it, and then put the harm back in place, because that is what the show did. That is what it always did. Peter Griffin at his most honest. The person under all the exaggeration and the cruelty and the relentless cartoon stupidity was a man who wanted very badly to be good at things he was not taught to be good at, who tried to love his family using only the tools he had been given, and who was never quite shown that the tools were inadequate before he needed them. There are millions of people who know that man. Not the cartoon, not the version that pushed his wife underwater or forgot his daughter existed. The version who was trying, imperfectly, without enough knowledge of how to do it well, and who sometimes managed something real and more often did not. That is who Peter started as. The show built him from something true. What happened afterward, season after season, was a gradual retreat from the truth he was built from, until what remained was an exaggeration with nothing underneath to hold it. The comedy stayed. The person the comedy was about had mostly left. Chris Griffin, the character, nobody examined. Chris Griffin is the most overlooked major character in Family Guy, and the reason he is overlooked is that the show did not develop him much. He occupied the slot of the awkward teenage son, amiable, dim, slightly strange in ways that were played for comedy without being explored, and the show was largely content to keep him there. He was good-natured. He was not cruel in the way Peter was cruel, or detached in the way Brian could be detached. He was present in the house without being particularly present in the show's creative priorities. But there is a detail about Chris that the show's own production history makes genuinely strange, and that is the origin of his voice. Seth Green, who voiced Chris from the second season onward, was reportedly dared by a friend to audition for the character using his best impression of Buffalo Bill from the 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs. Buffalo Bill is a serial killer who skins his female victims. The voice, delivered in that audition, got Seth Green the role. Chris Griffin sounds the way he sounds because his voice actor was doing his best impression of a fictional serial killer, and the people making the show liked it. The show acknowledged this directly in a later episode where Chris, in a moment that the show treated as a reference to its own inside joke, reenacted Buffalo Bill's most famous scene, the dance in front of the mirror, in the low light, with the specific physical staging that is one of the most disturbing images in mainstream American cinema. Chris performed it. His family was mortified. The show played it as a comedy beat. But think about the accumulation of this. The character who is supposed to be the ordinary teenage son of a family sitcom was built, from his voice up, on the impression of a fictional monster. The show knew this and referenced it. The reference made the audience laugh because of the incongruity good-natured Chris doing the Buffalo Bill dance. But incongruity and revelation are sometimes the same thing. The incongruity here is that the ordinary son is performing something that was always present in the DNA of how he was written. Not in any surface-level way, Chris was never portrayed as violent or dangerous. But the origin of his voice was always this, and the show chose to tell us so. Chris also had a recurring plotline in which a voice in his closet gave him dark instructions and general bad advice. The voice, presented as a joke, was the show's way of acknowledging that something in Chris's character was not fully resolved, that there was a dimension of him that existed in the dark behind the ordinary exterior. The closet is where the voice lived, and the closet is where things that cannot be addressed directly tend to go in the domestic spaces the show depicted. The world outside the house. The show's world was never just the house on Spooner Street. Quahog had a full ecology of secondary and recurring characters, each with their own version of the particular darkness the show was interested in. Mayor Adam West, played with extraordinary commitment by the late Adam West, was a character whose comedy was built entirely on the premise that the mayor of a city was operating under some form of significant cognitive impairment or delusion or both. He took things literally that were not meant literally. He acted on instructions that no reasonable person would have taken as instructions. He spent the city's resources on things that had no relationship to governance. He was, functionally, someone who should not have been in a position of civic authority and who had ended up there through mechanisms the show never explained. The comedy of Mayor Adam West was the comedy of a person who was clearly unwell in some capacity, holding a position that required consistent, competent judgment, which is, in its specific shape, the shape of a horror story. The show eventually let West himself address this. In a moment of characteristic sincerity within the comedy, the character said something to the effect that he was not crazy, he just had a different way of seeing the world. The defense was not compelling. But the fact that the character offered it that the show allowed Mayor Adam West to assert his own coherence in the face of overwhelming evidence against it gave him a dignity that the pure comedy version of the character would not have had. He was not just the joke. He was a person living inside an experience that other people could not see the validity of, trying to explain himself in a context where explanation was not going to be enough. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family's physician, was another secondary character built around a premise that became more disturbing the more the show used him. He was a doctor who was not a good doctor, who regularly failed to diagnose, mismanaged treatment, and operated at a level of professional incompetence that his patients survived through luck more than through his competence. The show played this as comedy about the medical establishment. But the specific form of the comedy, the patient's total dependence on a professional who was not reliable, captured something real about the relationship between ordinary people and the systems that are supposed to serve them. You go to the doctor. You trust the doctor. The doctor is doing the best they can within limits you cannot assess and have no access to information about. The comedy of Dr. Hartman was the comedy of realizing that trust is a structural requirement of the situation and not a guarantee of the outcome. Cleveland Brown, before he left Quahog for his own spin-off series, was one of the more interesting presences in Peter's immediate social world. His calm was the most reliable thing about him, a steady, measured affect that absorbed the chaos around him without being destabilized by it. His departure from the group was presented as a simple narrative choice to launch a spin-off, but within the world of the show it read as something slightly different. As the person who was the most grounded in the group, deciding to go somewhere less relentlessly chaotic, Cleveland took himself out of the dynamic, and the group that remained became, without the anchor his specific quality of presence had provided, marginally more extreme in its collective dysfunction. Joe Swanson's arc across the show was one of its most clearly structured and least appreciated. He was introduced as the cool new neighbor everyone admired, capable, respected, admired for his physical courage despite using a wheelchair. The show spent multiple seasons turning him into the object of his friends' mockery, allowing his disability to become a punchline rather than a character trait, letting his marriage deteriorate, diminishing his standing in the group from someone the others looked up to towards someone the others condescended to. The transformation mirrored, with a specificity that was probably not entirely accidental, the way that competent people sometimes get treated in groups that are not comfortable with competence. The person who makes everyone else look bad by comparison becomes, over time, the person everyone else needs to make look bad. Extended section. The show's relationship with its own darkness. There is a specific and interesting thing Family Guy did across its run that did not get enough critical attention while it was happening. The show developed a habit of acknowledging its own darkest impulses from within itself. It would notice what it was doing, name it, make a joke about the naming, and then continue doing the thing it had just named. This is different from ordinary self-awareness. Ordinary self-awareness implies a capacity to change behavior based on recognition. What the show was doing was more like confession without amendment. It saw what it was, it acknowledged it, it produced comedy from the acknowledgement, and then it continued. The meta-commentary on the show's treatment of Meg is the clearest example. The show repeatedly, across many seasons, had other characters and occasionally Meg herself acknowledge that her treatment was wrong. The show knew it was wrong. The show said it was wrong through the mouths of its own characters. And then it kept doing it because the acknowledgement was more useful than the change would have been. Acknowledgement produced comedy. Change would have required a different show. The Conway Twitty gag that became one of the most notorious recurring bits in the later seasons operated on exactly this logic. The show would substitute a full, unedited performance of a Conway Twitty song for an actual joke, and the performance would go on for minutes without any punchline. The joke, to whatever extent there was a joke, was that there was no joke. The show had simply replaced the comedy with a country music performance and was waiting to see if the audience would sit through it. The audience usually sat through it, which was, in its way, the most damning possible commentary on the dynamic between the show and the people watching it. The show could do anything, including nothing, and a significant number of people would watch anyway. That discovery, once made, produced a specific kind of creative permissiveness that was not good for the show's quality, but was very good for the show's sense of its own immunity to consequence. The cutaway gag at its worst was also an exercise in this kind of permissiveness. The show could insert any random sequence of images and call it a joke because the audience had been conditioned to receive any sudden visual shift as comedy. The setup line, "This is worse than the time when," or "This reminds me of," was a signal that comedy was coming, and once the signal had been trained into the audience, the comedy itself was not strictly required. The signal was enough, which meant the show could substitute the signal for the thing the signal used to promise. But the show at its best was something genuinely different from this. The best episodes of Family Guy, the ones that held the show's first season quality or exceeded it, were not coasting on any of these mechanisms. They were doing the harder work of building something that mattered through characters and situations that were specific and real, in the way that fictional situations can be real when they have been thought through carefully. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode was this. The early Stewie episodes were this. The episode where Peter's father died, and Peter had to grapple with the specific grief of losing a parent he had never been fully close to, was this. These episodes existed because the people making the show were capable of them. The talent was always there. What changed over the course of the show's run was not the available capability but the consistent deployment of it. The show stopped requiring its best of itself in most episodes and started requiring only enough to fill 22 minutes. And the audience, who had been generous enough to keep watching across the seasons of declining ambition, kept watching anyway, which closed the loop. The show discovered it did not need to be good to keep going. And once that discovery was made, going became easier than being good. Extended section, The Larger World of Seth MacFarlane and Why It Matters. Seth MacFarlane is one of the few people in the history of American entertainment who built a creative empire from a single show's success and then found ways to extend that empire into substantially different territories without losing the essential quality of what he was doing. American Dad is a genuinely excellent animated comedy that sustained its quality across far more seasons than Family Guy managed to. The Orville, which he created, executive produced, wrote for, and starred in, became one of the most earnest and intelligent science fiction series produced in the 2010s, a show that was sometimes criticized precisely for taking its genre too seriously, which is a form of criticism that reveals more about the critical landscape than about the show itself. His music, the jazz and big band albums he recorded represented yet another departure into a register of warmth and sentiment that his comedy work did not usually allow. What runs through all of it is a quality that is harder to name than any of its specific expressions. A quality of care for the thing being made that is visible in the finished product as a certain kind of rigorousness, a certain unwillingness to leave well enough alone when better is available. MacFarlane is a perfectionist in the specific way that people who understand a craft are perfectionists, not rigidity, but precision. A knowledge of what the right version looks like, and an investment in getting there. This quality was most visible in Family Guy in the seasons when he was most involved. When he stepped back from the day-to-day creative oversight of the show, the quality of the show's ambition changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently over time. The people who ran the show in his absence were capable and experienced, and the show they made was often funny and occasionally brilliant. But the specific quality of the early seasons, the feeling that someone with a very clear idea of what this should be was steering every decision, faded in their absence. The Orville is the clearest illustration of what MacFarlane was doing when he had full creative control over something. It is a show that could have been lazy in 100 ways and refused to be lazy in any of them. It took its premise, a comedic science fiction series structured on the model of classic Star Trek, and then took the premise seriously enough to produce stories that were not comedies at all in the ordinary sense, but genuine explorations of the human situations that science fiction has always been best at exploring. The episodes about gender and identity, about democracy and authoritarianism, about what it means to be present for someone who is dying, these were not the episodes a lazy show produces. They were the episodes a show produces when the person running it thinks the genre deserves to be treated with full seriousness. That person had always been present in the best episodes of Family Guy. The show just did not give him room to be that person consistently across 20-plus seasons of network television, with all the commercial pressures and production schedules and internal politics that producing that volume of content involves. The show that could have been, the one that the best episodes demonstrated was possible, was always a slightly different show than the one that aired. More consistent. More willing to stay in difficult territory rather than retreating to the safer ground of shock or randomness. A show that cared about who these characters were in the way that the early seasons clearly cared. The gap between the show that was possible and the show that existed is the gap that the show's history is ultimately about. Not just the gap between early seasons and late seasons, though that gap is real and documented. The larger gap, visible across the entire run if you are looking for it, between the thing being made and the thing that might have been made if the conditions had been right. Most long-running shows have this gap. Most creative projects have this gap. The thing that exists and the thing that was possible were always going to be different. But Family Guy makes the gap visible in a specific way because the early seasons left such a clear record of what the possible version looked like. You can hold those two versions next to each other, the Season 1 version and the Season 15 version, and see the distance between them in a way that is specific and sad, in the way that specific and sad things are. The show kept going because the economics supported it continuing. The show continues to go for the same reasons. As long as the numbers work, the show exists. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply true. Television is a commercial enterprise. The shows that survive are the shows that generate revenue. Family Guy generates revenue from broadcast rights, streaming, reruns, licensing, and merchandise, with a consistency that has nothing to do with creative quality and everything to do with brand recognition and catalog value. The show is an asset. It will be managed as an asset for as long as the asset produces returns. But the first 3 seasons, the ones that started everything, the ones that earned the loyalty that eventually brought the show back from its first cancellation and then its second, the ones that produced the fan base that kept the reruns dominant on Adult Swim and the DVDs moving off shelves, those seasons were not managed. They were created by someone who had something specific he wanted to say and the capability to say it, and the specific energy and ambition and investment that only the first attempt at something ever fully contains. The thing that always existed in the show's later seasons was the residue of that original energy. The brand recognition was built on the quality of the thing that had been created, and the brand continued on the back of that recognition long after the creation had changed substantially. That is the story of many successful things, and it does not make the later work without value. It just means that the later work is something different from what the earlier work was, and that understanding the difference is part of understanding the whole. Extended section: What fan communities found that the show did not know it was saying. Fan communities around long-running shows develop a kind of collective intelligence that the creators of those shows often do not anticipate and sometimes find unnerving. They watch at a level of attention and volume that no individual viewer can match. They catalog. They cross-reference. They notice things that appear once in an early episode and appear again years later, and they hold those things in relation to each other and ask what the connection means. They produce theories that are sometimes absurd and sometimes startlingly close to things the writers intended, and occasionally produce readings of the material that reveal things about the show that the writers did not consciously put there but that were there anyway. Family Guy fan communities have been particularly active in this kind of work, and the theories and analyses they have produced form a body of criticism that is, in aggregate, one of the more interesting things to have been written about the show. Not all of it is accurate, not all of it is careful. But the best of it demonstrates a genuine engagement with the show's actual content at a depth that most formal criticism of animated comedy does not reach. The Peter is dead theory, which we covered in full earlier, is the most circulated example. But there were others. One theory proposed that the entire show is actually a television program being watched by the characters of American Dad, that Family Guy exists as a piece of popular entertainment within the universe, where Stan Smith and his family live, and that the meta moments in Family Guy where characters break the fourth wall are not the characters of Family Guy acknowledging they are in a show, but rather continuity errors in the fictional television program that the American Dad characters are watching. This theory gained traction partly because American Dad made a specific reference to Brian Griffin as a fictional dog character, and partly because the crossover between the two shows, while depicted as happening within a shared reality, could also be read as the American Dad characters entering the fiction they usually watch from outside. The theory about Brian's origins, that he is a CIA genetic experiment rather than a naturally occurring talking dog, draws on several pieces of evidence from within the show, including the explicit existence of CIA-created talking animals in American Dad's universe. The two shows confirmed shared continuity, Brian's specific and unusual capabilities, and the fact that the show never explained how Brian came to be what he is. The theory is not proven by any of this evidence. It is made plausible by it, and plausibility in the context of a long-running show is often the closest thing to confirmation that fan analysis can achieve. There was also a theory about Stewie and Meg, that Meg is in some sense Stewie's actual mother, rather than Lois. This theory was built on scattered timeline ambiguities in the show's continuity, and on certain visual and behavioral cues that fans argued were too consistent to be accidental. The theory never achieved the cultural penetration of the Peter is dead theory, partly because its evidentiary base was thinner and partly because its implications were considerably more uncomfortable. But the fact that it circulated at all, and that it found an audience willing to take it seriously, speaks to the depth of attention that certain segments of the fan community were bringing to the show's details. What all of these theories share, beyond their specific content, is a common underlying impulse. They are all attempts to explain why things are the way they are, why Meg is treated the way she is treated, why Brian behaves the way he behaves, why the show's world keeps resetting, why certain characters are capable of things they should not be capable of, why the darkness that exists throughout the show seems to exceed what a comedy show should contain. The theories are answers to questions that the show raised but did not answer, and the specific answers the fan community arrived at say something about what kinds of explanations feel most consistent with the evidence that was actually there. The consistent preference for explanations that involve grief, trauma, loss, and the specific damage that families do to each other over generations is not accidental. Those explanations feel right because the show, even when it was not consciously pursuing them, was building something that had that quality. The structures it built around its characters, the isolation, the performance, the inability to be seen clearly, the harm that passes from parent to child without anyone fully choosing to pass it, are the structures of stories about families in pain, not stories about happy families with occasional problems. Stories about families that carry damage in the way that damage gets carried, which is quietly and below the surface and across time. The fan communities noticed. They named what they saw. And the names they chose, grief, loss, trauma, the weight of what parents give and do not give their children, were the right names. Extended section, the music and the tone you were never quite hearing. One of the things about Family Guy that gets discussed least in any serious way is the show's music. The early seasons, in particular, had a musical sensibility that was more sophisticated than the show's reputation suggested, a consequence of MacFarlane's deep affection for the big band and jazz standards tradition, which bled into the show in ways that were not just incidental. The musical numbers that Family Guy produced, particularly in the early and middle seasons, were not just comedy sequences with songs in them. They were genuinely staged and choreographed musical theater sequences, with the kind of production values and performance quality that reflected real craft. The song Surfin' Bird in the Season 7 episode I Dream of Jesus was not just a joke about an annoying song, it was an extraordinarily committed performance of an extraordinarily committed annoyance, executed with the precision that makes the joke land at full force. The original songs the show produced for various episodes, some of them parodies, some of them genuinely original compositions, were frequently better than they needed to be, made with more care than the comedic context demanded. MacFarlane's musical background informed the show's tonal register in ways beyond the musical numbers themselves. The score for early Family Guy episodes had a quality that was warmer and more specific than what you usually heard in animated comedies. The music knew when to be quiet. It knew when to let a scene breathe without underlining everything. It had the quality of music made by someone who understood how music functions in the space between what is happening on screen and what the audience is feeling about it. This was not something the audience consciously registered. That is what good scoring does. It operates below conscious awareness, shaping the emotional experience of the scene without the viewer being able to identify why they are feeling what they are feeling. But the difference between a scene scored with care and a scene scored with indifference is something the body knows even when the mind does not. The early seasons of Family Guy felt a certain way. Part of what produced that feeling was the writing and the animation and the character work. Part of it was the music. When the music changed in later seasons, when it became more generic, more reflexive, less attuned to the specific emotional register of the scenes it was undersigning, the show felt different. Not necessarily worse on any single axis, but different in the specific way that a room feels different when the acoustics change. The same words in the same space, but the sound of them arriving in your ears in a different way. Imperceptible to most viewers, but real. McFarlane's love of the old radio mystery format, which he has mentioned in interviews, describing his early exposure to 1930s and 1940s radio drama as a significant influence on his sense of story and atmosphere, also surfaced in the show in ways that were easy to miss. The particular way that Family Guy built tension in its more ambitious episodes drew on storytelling techniques that came from radio drama rather than from contemporary television. The reliance on voice and dialogue to carry weight that visual medium usually distributes across image and sound. The specific pacing of certain reveals. The way certain episodes built toward a single moment that the entire episode had been constructed to deliver. This is not the show that casual viewers experienced. The show that casual viewers experienced was funnier and louder and more direct, but underneath the loud version there was this quieter thing, present in the choices that shaped how the show felt, rather than what it explicitly said. The love of old radio and big band and jazz standards, the tendency toward warmth in the musical choices even when the visual content was anything but warm. The quality of care for the craft that showed up in the things the audience could not quite name but could definitely feel. The final quiet thing. There is something that emerges when you have been through all of this. Not a conclusion, exactly. Something softer than a conclusion. An observation that the whole journey has been building toward without quite arriving at until the end. The show that millions of people fell asleep to, that lived in the background of so many rooms in so many years, that became part of the texture of ordinary life in the specific way that only very familiar things do. That show was doing something that it never quite said out loud. It was doing it through the structure, through the resets, through the way the characters kept failing to see each other and kept returning to the same table anyway. It was saying that the ordinary life of a family, the one that is neither dramatic nor beautiful, that is not the life you imagined having, and is not the life that would look like anything in a story about what good lives look like. That ordinary, imperfect life is worth something. Not because of what it achieves, not because the people in it manage to love each other well or understand each other clearly, or avoid the harm that families routinely do to the people inside them. Worth something because they are there. Because the house is there. Because the address stays the same and the faces are the same faces, and the table is set the same way every evening. Families persist. They persist through things that should end them. They persist through specific failures and accumulated damage and years of not quite getting to the conversation that would change things. They persist because the alternative, the world in which the family has stopped existing, in which the faces are gone and the house is empty and the address is someone else's, is a world that most people will do a tremendous amount to avoid. The show about a family that could not find each other, made by a man who almost did not survive to make it, watched by millions of people who fell asleep to the sound of a family being imperfectly present. What it was always about was right there in the reset, in the fact that no matter what happened, the next episode began in the same place. The family was still there, the house was still warm, the faces were still the faces. That is what was underneath all of it. And it is worth knowing, because what was underneath was not horror, after all, or not only horror. What was underneath was the thing that horror is always in the proximity of, which is the thing you are afraid to lose. The family. Imperfect and present. Still there. Still there. If you are still here, in whatever room you are in, and at whatever hour this is finding you, thank you. This one was long and slow and went places that most videos about this show do not go. You stayed with it, and that matters more than I can easily say. Drop a comment with where you are and what time it is, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It is free, it takes a second, and it means you will be there the next time. Whatever this night is, I hope it is quiet. I hope whatever you needed from this, you found it. See you in the next one. Section 13, The Time That Stopped. Family Guy's fractured relationship with aging, memory, and the frozen world. There is a particular kind of unease that settles in when you watch Family Guy for long enough and begin to notice something that the show never directly acknowledges. The children do not age. The parents do not age. Seasons pass and Family Guy has had more than 20 of them, which by any human measure is a significant stretch of time, but the Griffins wake up every week in the same house, with the same faces, in what appears to be approximately the same year. Stewie is a baby at the beginning of Season 1. Stewie is a baby at the end of Season 22. Chris is a teenager. Meg is a teenager. Peter is a middle-aged man with a belly and a thin hairline, and the slightly blurred quality of someone who has been drinking since sometime in the afternoon. None of this is unusual for animated television. The Simpsons has been doing the same thing for 3 decades. South Park runs on the same logic. The frozen nature of cartoon families is one of the genre's defining conventions, as natural to animation as the fact that characters in these worlds can survive falls from great heights and explosions that would kill a real person instantly. You accept it the way you accept anything structural, not by thinking about it, but by not thinking about it. But Family Guy does something interesting with this convention. It does not simply ignore the frozen time in the way that most animated shows do. It periodically draws your attention to it. It gestures toward the strangeness of a world that will not move forward. And in doing so, it transforms what might have been a simple technical convention into something that has the texture of something darker and stranger. Consider what the frozen time actually means for these characters if you take it seriously for even a moment. Meg Griffin has been 17 years old for more than 2 decades of broadcast television. She has been enduring the specific misery of 17, the invisibility, the rejection, the daily accumulation of small humiliations, the desperate hope that adulthood will somehow be the escape that adolescence never is for longer than many of the show's actual viewers have been alive. She does not get to leave. The escape that every teenager tells themselves is coming the moment when you finish school and move out and become someone different in a new place does not come for Meg. It cannot come. The show's structure will not permit it. This is, if you allow yourself to think about it at any length, genuinely disturbing. Not in the way that horror fiction is disturbing, not the sudden sharp shock of a frightening image, but in the way that certain philosophical thought experiments are disturbing. The kind of disturbance that comes not from something happening to you, but from a slow recognition of something about the structure of a situation. Meg is frozen in the worst years. She will always be in the worst years. The relief she is waiting for will never arrive, because the show cannot permit time to move in the direction of relief. And Stewie. Stewie is frozen in infancy. The character who has the most fully realized interior life on the show, the one with the most ambition and the most complexity and the most capacity for genuine emotional depth, is trapped in a body that cannot speak to most people, cannot be taken seriously by the world, cannot act on his own plans without the structural limitations of being a child who cannot drive or sign contracts or acquire funding for his projects through legitimate channels. Stewie is a person of extraordinary capacity living inside the most constrained possible situation, and the show will never allow him out of it. Whatever he builds, whatever he plots, whatever emotional breakthrough he achieves in a given episode, next week he will be back in the same crib, in the same room, making the same sounds to the same uncomprehending adults. There is a version of this that reads as tragedy. Not the performed tragedy of a character in a story who suffers toward meaning, but the quieter, stranger tragedy of a situation that has no resolution built into it. The story cannot end with Stewie growing up and becoming the person his mind already is, because the show cannot end. Stewie's imprisonment is a condition of the show's continuation. Every new season is another year of the same cage. What makes this interesting rather than simply bleak is what the show occasionally does with it. The episode Road to the Multiverse, one of the show's most ambitious and genuinely inventive episodes, is built around a machine that allows Stewie and Brian to travel between parallel universes, each one operating under different physical and narrative laws. The Disney universe where everything is bright and musical and safe. The universe where humans evolved from dogs. The universe where the laws of cartoon physics apply directly to reality. Each parallel world is a comment on a different way that stories can be told, a different set of rules about how a fictional world can be constructed. The episode is funny. It is also, if you are paying attention, deeply melancholy. The machine that lets Stewie escape his frozen world works only within the episode. At the end, he and Brian are back in Quahog, back in the house, back in the same temporal trap that the rest of the show inhabits. The multiverse travel was real within the logic of the episode, but it changes nothing. The next week, the machine is gone and the situation is unchanged. This is what the show does. It periodically gives you a window into what it might look like if the characters could escape the frozen time through dream sequences, through holiday specials, through the Stewie and Brian road trip episodes that allow for a different kind of story, and then closes the window and returns you to the house and the family and the week that is indistinguishable from every other week. Peter Griffin's relationship with time has its own particular quality. Peter is a man who seems to exist in perpetual middle age, not the middle age of someone who has arrived at a stable and dignified place in life, but the middle age of someone who has been in the middle of things for a very long time without the middle resolving into anything. He is not young. He cannot claim the excuse of youth for his behavior. He is old enough to have 3 children and a mortgage and a marriage of more than 20 years. But he is also not old in the way that people become old when time has genuinely moved for them, when they carry the weight of what the years have actually done to a body and a mind and a set of relationships. Peter is stuck between too old to be excused, too young or too frozen to have arrived anywhere. The show traps him there deliberately, because moving him out of that particular position would change what the show fundamentally is. A Peter who has genuinely grown through his failures would be a different kind of character in a different kind of show. The Peter the show needs is the one who learns something in the 3rd act of an episode and then forgets it before the next one begins. This is the specific mercy the frozen time provides, and it is a mercy, in the same way that certain kinds of forgetting are mercies. Peter's failures do not accumulate into a verdict on his life, because the life does not accumulate. Each episode is self-contained in a way that protects him from the full weight of what he has done over 20-plus seasons. The time that stopped is what allows him to persist without being destroyed by his own history. There are episodes that gesture toward this. The episode Peter's Two Dads, which introduces Peter's biological father Mickey McFinnigan, and the episode Mess You Missed, which revisited and deepened Peter's relationship with his family history, both drew on the show's capacity to periodically reach into the frozen past and pull something out that had weight and consequence. The flashbacks the show uses both as comedy devices and as genuine narrative tools operate in a different temporal register than the main story. The past, in Family Guy, is more fluid than the present. Things can be added to it. New memories can be inserted retroactively. The history of these characters is not fixed in the way that real history is fixed. It is a living thing that the show can reach into and reshape. This, too, if you think about it, is slightly uncanny. The past can change, but the present cannot move. The characters are free to have had experiences that we did not witness. The flashback structure gives them a hidden history that is constantly expanding. But those experiences do not lead anywhere. They cannot produce growth that persists into the following episode. The expanded past enriches the characters without changing their trajectory. It is not quite right to call this nihilistic. The show is not saying that time is meaningless or that change is impossible. It is doing something more specific and more interesting. It is creating a world in which the warmth and familiarity of a recurring family, the comfort of knowing these faces and this house is maintained by preventing the conditions under which that warmth and familiarity would have to be renegotiated. Time stops because allowing it to move would require asking harder questions about what this family actually is and whether it can survive honest examination. The house stays warm, the family stays together, the week resets. And somewhere in that recurring warmth there is both the comfort the show was always offering and the shadow of what the comfort costs. Section 14 Death and the Show That Could Not Let Go. What happened when Family Guy killed its characters. There is a moment in Family Guy's history that the show has never quite recovered from and never quite moved past, and that in some ways defined everything that came after it. On the 24th of November, 2013, in an episode called Life of Brian, the show killed Brian Griffin. Not in the way that animated shows typically kill characters as a fake-out, as a joke, as a moment of peril that resolves within the episode. The show killed Brian in earnest. He was struck by a car in front of his family. He said goodbye to Stewie in the veterinarian's office, in a scene that was quiet and genuinely devastating, and then he died. The episode ended. The following episode introduced Vinny, a new family dog voiced by Tony Sirico, designed as a permanent replacement. What happened next was remarkable and somewhat alarming. The audience response was not simply disappointment or the ordinary sadness that comes from losing a familiar character. It was grief, expressed at a scale and with an intensity that surprised even the people who had made the decision. Hundreds of thousands of viewers signed petitions. Social media platforms still relatively new as spaces for collective response in 2013, filled with expressions of loss that went beyond the typical fan frustration at a story development they disliked. People were genuinely bereaved. 14 episodes later, in an episode called Christmas Guy, Stewie traveled back in time and prevented Brian's death. Brian was alive again. The audience relief was enormous, and the show returned to its previous configuration as though nothing had happened. There is a lot to say about this sequence of events. The most obvious thing is that the show discovered, in the most direct possible way, the degree to which Brian had become emotionally central to the audience's experience of the show. Not Peter, despite his nominal position as the protagonist. Not Lois, despite her function as the show's moral anchor. Brian, the dog who spoke and drank wine and wrote bad novels and had a complicated friendship with a 1-year-old, was the character whose death the audience could not accept. This is interesting in itself, and worth sitting with. Brian's emotional centrality makes a kind of sense if you think about what Brian actually represents in the show's economy. He is the character who exists in proximity to both worlds, the human world, which he can navigate through speech and intellect and cultural literacy, and the animal world, which he cannot entirely leave behind. He is the character who wants to be something he cannot quite become, the failed novelist, the dog who fancies himself a man, the one who sees things clearly and cannot make his clear sight matter. Brian is also the character who functions as Stewie's primary emotional bond. The Stewie-Brian relationship is the show's most consistent source of genuine warmth, not the performed warmth of a family sitcom, but the more complicated and more honest warmth of two people who see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. Their road trip episodes work because the relationship underneath them is real in the way that few animated relationships are. They irritate each other. They disappoint each other. They are fundamentally mismatched in certain ways that make their closeness more meaningful rather than less. When Brian died, Stewie lost the only person who could fully hear him, the only relationship in which Stewie's true self was legible to someone else. This was, for the audience, not simply the loss of a funny character. It was the destruction of the show's most honest emotional connection. The decision to bring Brian back, made in direct response to audience grief, was interpreted by some critics as a failure of narrative nerve. The show had made a bold choice and then immediately retreated from it. The resurrection undercut the stakes of the original death, demonstrated that the show would not allow its most significant choices to stand, and established that audience pressure could reverse story decisions. All of these criticisms have merit, but there is another way to read what happened, one that is more interesting if less flattering to anyone involved. The show discovered something about its own emotional architecture that it had not fully understood before. The audience's grief was not simply attachment to a character. It was grief about what the character's existence made possible, the specific kind of emotional reality that the Stewie-Brian relationship had created, and that could not exist in any other configuration the show might produce. Vinny was a competent replacement in every technical sense. He was funny. Tony Sirico brought genuine warmth and specificity to the role. But Vinny could not be what Brian was to Stewie, because what Brian was to Stewie was not a function of personality traits that could be replicated. It was the function of years of specific shared history, of a relationship built episode by episode that had accumulated something that no new character could simply inherit. The resurrection was, in this reading, not a narrative failure but a recognition of an emotional fact. The show could not replace what Brian represented any more than a real family could replace a central relationship with a similar but different version of the same thing. The audience knew this before the writers did, and the grief they expressed was the mechanism by which that knowledge was communicated. What the Brian death and resurrection sequence revealed about the show's relationship to death more broadly is also worth examining. Family Guy has killed characters many times. It has killed minor characters constantly, in the way that animated comedies do, as a source of dark comedy that relies on the audience not being too invested in the victims. It has killed characters in dream sequences and what-if scenarios. It has killed characters who then appeared in subsequent episodes without explanation, the reset erasing the death, the way the reset erases everything. The deaths that the show treated as permanent, or meant to treat as permanent, before the Brian resurrection complicated the calculus were the deaths of characters like Muriel Goldman, Quagmire's father Dan, and various one-episode characters whose death served a specific narrative function. These deaths stuck because the characters did not need to return. They had served their purpose and could be allowed to remain gone. But the show's core cast exists in a different category. They cannot die permanently because the show requires their presence. This is not a secret, it is the structural reality of episodic television. But Family Guy has been more explicit about this than most shows. Perhaps because the show's willingness to play with dark content and nihilistic comedy has occasionally led it close to the edge of a boundary it cannot actually cross. There is something worth noticing in the way the show handles near death for its main characters. The brushes with death are frequent enough to constitute a pattern. Peter has nearly died many times. Brian has died and been resurrected. Stewie has committed violence and been subjected to violence at a scale that would end any human life many times over. The show uses death and near death as a comic register, as a way to heighten stakes temporarily without committing to consequences. This produces an odd relationship between the audience and the show's capacity for genuine dramatic weight. You know, at some level, that the consequences will not stick. The reset is coming. Whatever happens in this episode will be resolved by the next one. This knowledge changes how you experience the show's darker moments, not as moments with genuine stakes, but as performances of stakes, acknowledged theatrical gestures toward a territory the show will not actually enter. And yet, the Brian death worked for 14 episodes in a way that the show's usual death as comedy does not. It worked because the audience did not treat it as a performance. They responded to it as if it were real. The grief they felt was genuine grief, not the performed grief of someone watching a story they know is a story. This is interesting because it suggests that Family Guy, despite its structural commitment to the reset, had built emotional investments in its characters that exceeded the show's own willingness to honor them. The audience had moved further into genuine attachment than the show's makers had realized. The death revealed the attachment. The resurrection honored it. And in doing so, the show acknowledged something about itself that it had not quite admitted before. It had become, despite everything, a show that people cared about. Not just watched, cared about. The distinction is important. You can watch something without caring about it. You can laugh at it and return to it and make it part of your regular viewing routine without ever investing emotionally in what happens to the people inside it. But caring the kind of caring that produces real grief when a character dies, that is something different. That requires the show to have made something real out of what might have remained merely amusing. Family Guy made something real. It did it inconsistently, and often accidentally, and sometimes in spite of rather than because of its own intentions. But it made it. And the Brian death and resurrection sequence is the clearest evidence of that, the moment when the show's audience demonstrated that what they had developed was not just a viewing habit, but a genuine relationship. That is not a small thing to have done. For a show that spent years being accused of having no heart beneath the shock comedy and the pop culture references, it is actually quite a significant thing. Section 15, the show that watched itself. Family Guy's relationship with its own legacy and what it means that it's still here. There comes a point in the life of any long-running television show when the show becomes as much about its own existence as it is about the stories it was originally built to tell. This happens to most shows that survive beyond their natural endpoint. The moment when a show has said what it had to say and faces the choice between ending cleanly and continuing in a form that requires renegotiating what it fundamentally is. The Simpsons reached this point sometime in its second decade and has been negotiating it ever since. Law and Order reached it and simply kept producing new versions of itself with new configurations of familiar elements. Some shows make this transition gracefully. Others become self-parody. Most become something in between shows that know they are echoes of themselves and have found ways to make that self-knowledge part of what they offer. Family Guy is in this territory now, and has been for longer than is usually acknowledged. The show that exists in its current form is not the same show that premiered in 1999 and was canceled and came back in 2005 on the strength of DVD sales and late-night Adult Swim airings. The original show had a specific energy that came partly from its novelty and partly from its aggression, the sense that it was doing something slightly transgressive, pushing against conventions in ways that felt genuinely risky rather than calculated. That energy is not fully replicable. You cannot have the feeling of seeing something for the first time twice. The show that returns for its 23rd season cannot produce the particular charge of the show that premiered to an audience that had never encountered it before. What the current show offers is something different, and in some ways more interesting. It offers a relationship with its own history and accumulated familiarity that has its own kind of weight. When Peter Griffin says something recognizably Peter Griffin in a season 20 episode, the comedy is not just about what he says. It is about the resonance of what he says with 20-plus years of who Peter Griffin has been. The joke lands differently because of what you know. The familiarity is not a limitation, it is the point. The show has become increasingly comfortable acknowledging this dynamic directly. Meta-humor about the show's own longevity, jokes about characters knowing they are in a long-running animated series, asides that acknowledge the absurdity of a show this old still producing new episodes, these are elements of the current show's comedic register in a way they were not in the early seasons. The show watches itself with one eye, aware of its own status as a cultural artifact, aware of the specific strangeness of a world that has been running continuously for more than 2 decades. This self-awareness is not always elegant. Meta-humor can become a crutch, a way of acknowledging problems rather than solving them, of noting the show's limitations with a wink that substitutes for actually addressing those limitations. The Family Guy that jokes about its own age is not the same as a Family Guy that has found a way to use its age to tell stories it could not have told when it was young. The former is defensiveness, dressed as sophistication. The latter would be something genuinely worth watching. But the current show occasionally achieves the latter. The episodes that use the show's accumulated history to access emotional registers that would not be available to a younger show, that return to relationships and character dynamics that have 20 seasons of context behind them, and draw on that context, deliberately those episodes suggest that the long run has produced something real, something that a show with fewer years behind it could not make. The Stewie and Brian road trip episodes have gotten better as the show has gotten older, not worse. The relationship those episodes draw on is richer now than it was in Season 3, because the specific texture of what Stewie and Brian are to each other has been built up over hundreds of episodes and more than 20 years. When an episode allows them to be genuinely vulnerable with each other as the best of their travel episodes, the vulnerability lands with a weight that it could not have had earlier. You know these people. You know what it costs them to be honest with each other. You know, from everything the show has built over 2 decades, what the specific quality of their care for each other looks like when it is expressed directly. This is what long-running shows can do that shorter, more acclaimed shows cannot. They can build relationships in real time, in audience time, not just story time. The relationship between the viewer and these characters has its own history, separate from the characters' histories with each other. And that viewer-character history, accumulated over years of watching the same faces in the same house, becomes part of what gives the show its particular quality. Seth MacFarlane himself has grown older while the show has remained frozen. He was in his late 20s when the show premiered. He is in his early 50s now. The gap between the age of the creator and the eternal middle age of the character he voices, Peter Griffin, who never gets older, has widened over decades into something significant. MacFarlane has become someone different. The show has stayed the same. What it means for a person to voice the same character for 25 years, to return again and again to a voice and a sensibility that represents a version of himself that was fixed decades ago, is something that probably deserves more examination than it has received. There are interviews from recent years in which MacFarlane has spoken about the show with a certain reflective quality, acknowledging its influence, assessing its legacy honestly, noting both what it got right and what it did not. There is the quality in these interviews of someone who has enough distance from the early seasons to see them clearly. Someone who made something in a particular moment with particular energies and particular blind spots, and who can now see both the thing itself and the conditions that produced it. The show's legacy in the broader cultural conversation has shifted significantly over the decades. The show that was controversial and transgressive in the early 2000s is now, depending on who you ask, either a comedy classic or a relic of a sensibility that has been rightly superseded. Both positions contain truths. The show that pushed against PC conventions in its early seasons was doing so in a context that gave that pushing a different meaning than it would have now. The cultural landscape has changed. What reads as transgressive in one decade can read as reactionary in another, depending on the direction that things have moved. The show has adapted to this in ways that are sometimes graceful and sometimes awkward. The willingness to revisit and apologize for specific decisions, the retirement of certain characters, the re-examination of certain dynamics, reflects a show that is not entirely static in its self-understanding. But adaptation to changing contexts is different from genuine evolution, and the show's core identity remains built on comedic instincts that were formed in a specific cultural moment and cannot be entirely divorced from it. What Family Guy will be remembered as, assuming that the question of what it is remembered as eventually becomes relevant, which for a show that is still producing new episodes is somewhat premature, is probably not what it was understood as in the moment. The show that its early audience watched and the show that historians of television will eventually describe are likely to be different in important ways. The early audience experienced the show's freshness and aggression and novelty. The historians will see the accumulated structure, the long relationships, the way the show navigated its own contradictions over more than 2 decades, the moments when it reached past what it was supposed to be and made something genuinely felt. The case for Family Guy as something worth taking seriously is not the case for it as great art. It is the case for it as a genuine cultural artifact, a show that reflects and refracts the culture that produced it, that captures something true about the specific texture of American family life in a particular era, that built genuine emotional relationships in the space between its own pretensions and its real capacities. The show knew what it was and was not entirely comfortable with it. That discomfort was generative. It produced things the show could not have made if it had been simply confident in its own identity. 25 years is a long time to be anywhere. It is long enough for the person you were when you started to have become someone quite different. It is long enough for the thing you made to have accumulated a history of its own that no longer belongs entirely to you. Family Guy belongs to its audience now in a way that it did not in 1999, when it was still entirely a MacFarlane creation. The audience has lived with it for too long, has brought too much of their own lives to the space of watching it, for the show to be fully given back to its creator. This is what it means to make something that lasts. The thing leaves you. It becomes part of other people's histories, other people's memories, the texture of other people's late nights and early mornings and the half-awake hour when sleep has almost arrived, and the television is on in the background, and the familiar voices of familiar characters are the last thing you hear before the day finally ends. Family Guy has been that voice for a lot of people. It has been in the room for a lot of important and unimportant moments. It has been the background noise of a lot of years. And the fact that it was doing something, quietly and without fanfare, underneath the noise, something about families and failure, and the specific grace of showing up imperfectly and remaining is worth knowing. That is the show underneath the show. And it was there all along, waiting for someone to be still enough to hear it. Thank you for listening. Wherever you are, whatever hour this is, drop it in the comments. And if this is the kind of content you come back for, subscribing keeps you here for the next one. Sleep well. A final note on why we watch. There is a question that does not get asked often enough about shows like Family Guy, shows that have been part of the furniture of millions of lives for so long that their presence has become automatic. The question is not why the show is good or whether it is good. The question is, what does it do for us? What need does it meet? What does the act of watching it, returning to it, falling asleep to it, supply? The easy answer is that it is funny. And it is. The early seasons of Family Guy are genuinely, technically, impressively funny. The comedic construction is tight in the way that only deliberate craft produces. The timing is specific. The jokes land because they are built correctly, with the attention to rhythm and subversion and the engineering of surprise that separates comedy that works from comedy that wants to work. MacFarlane and his writers, at their best, were doing something that required real skill. But funny does not explain why people fall asleep to it. You do not fall asleep to something merely because it makes you laugh. Laughter is the opposite of sleep. Physiologically speaking, it is arousal, engagement, the body responding to something with energy. What you fall asleep to has to provide something else. Something that laughter can accompany but is not produced by. Something closer to comfort. Something that makes the nervous system believe it is safe to let go. What Family Guy provides, at the register where it meets sleepy audiences in dark rooms at late hours, is the presence of a family that is still there, still bickering and failing and making the same mistakes, still sitting at the same table, still in the same house, still existing in the warm, lit, continuous way that a family exists when it has not yet been broken by the things that can break families. Many of the people watching Family Guy late at night come from families that were not like this. Families that were broken in various ways, that did not persist in the warm, continuous manner that the Griffin house persists. Families where the house changed addresses, or the faces changed configuration, or the specific quality of safety that a family can provide at its best was not reliably available. These viewers watch the Griffins and receive something from the watching that is not about the Griffins at all. It is about a need for something the show can perform, if not fully provide. This is not a small thing to notice about the show. It is, in fact, one of the most significant things. Family Guy has functioned for many viewers as a form of surrogate family, not because they believe the Griffins are real, but because the consistent presence of the Griffins, week after week and year after year, has supplied a kind of reliability that the human world does not always manage to supply. The show is always there. The house is always lit. The family is always intact. The horror underneath the show, the dark readings, the disturbing theories, the evidence of suppressed violence and trauma and dysfunction is not a contradiction of this comfort. It is, paradoxically, what makes the comfort more real. A family without shadow would be a fantasy too thin to lean on. The darkness in the Griffins is what makes them recognizable. It is what makes the house feel like a real house rather than a set. We believe in the warmth of the Griffin home precisely because we also believe, somewhere below the comedy, in the weight of what that warmth is holding off. This is why the show about an imperfect family became the show that so many people turn to at the end of the day. Not despite its darkness, but because of it. The comfort it provides is not the comfort of a world without trouble. It is the comfort of a world where the trouble is familiar, contained, and does not change the fundamental fact that the family is still there, still together, still at the same table when the next episode begins. That is the thing worth carrying away from all of this. The show is still there. And for a lot of people, in a lot of dark rooms, at a lot of late hours, so are you. And that is enough. On the art of noticing, the thing that unites every section of this script, every dark corner examined and every hidden layer uncovered, is the act of noticing. Family Guy rewards the viewer who pays a different kind of attention, who sits with the show rather than simply passing through it, who allows the quieter things to surface alongside the louder things. The show was not designed to be watched this way. It was designed to be consumed in the half-distracted state that most television is consumed in, with part of your attention on the screen and part of it somewhere else, with the show providing enough stimulation to keep you from leaving without demanding so much that you cannot also be elsewhere. This is how most television works. It is not a criticism. It is a description of the medium and the context in which it is received. But the shows that survive long enough to become cultural furniture accumulate layers that were not necessarily intended, that emerge from the density of what has been made and the distance of years and the collective attention of millions of people looking carefully at the same thing from different angles. Family Guy has accumulated these layers. The dark readings, the fan theories, the serious analyses of what the show is actually doing beneath its surface comedy, these are not impositions on the show from outside. They are discoveries made possible by the show's own richness, the depth of character work, and thematic consistency that the best episodes achieved. To notice the Peter is dead theory is to notice something about grief and coping, and the stories we tell ourselves when reality becomes unbearable. To notice Meg's arc across 20-plus seasons is to notice something true about the way families assign roles and the cost of carrying them. To notice what the giant chicken fights are actually doing, what emotional function they serve for Peter, what they represent in the economy of a life that does not give him many spaces to be fully present, is to notice something about the hunger for intensity that ordinary life does not satisfy. These are not trivial observations. They are the kinds of observations that art is supposed to produce an engagement with the material that leads back out to the world and to the specific texture of human experience. Family Guy is not great art in the way that the canon defines great art, but it is more than it was given credit for being. It did things with more skill and more intentionality than its reputation suggested. And the people who watched it in dark rooms late at night, who fell asleep to the sound of a familiar family in a warm house, were receiving something real from the watching. The horror was there. The darkness was there. The suppressed grief and the failed communication and the quiet tragedy of characters who could not quite reach each other across the space the show had built between them. All of that was there. But the warmth was there too. The specific warmth of a family that stays. That keeps sitting at the same table. That does not, despite everything, stop existing. That was always there too. And it always will be.